Ladies and gentlemen. Just kidding. Today is November the 12th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. This is a living, breathing conversation where you, the chat, can be a part of it. We are about to begin what is known as World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Doing all right. How are you doing, sir?
Ooh, doing okay. Been unusually busy this week.
Oh, with what?
Just proofreading gig.
Good. Good to have some work.
Yeah, so a little distracted from the news this week, correspondingly.
That's okay. I got a bunch of different things I jotted down.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, some of them funny, some of them not.
I don't think too much happened the past week, really.
Tell that to the poor, innocent lion that busted out of the circus jail and is now roaming free in Italy. Let's go, lion! Round of applause for the lion. It's a good news item.
Yeah. There's always stuff like that happening somewhere.
Yeah. And then what else did I see? There's an electric motorcycle that now charges in 10 minutes. So that's a cool just technology check mark.
Huh.
There was
neat.
one that I feel like we can just knock it out because it's not really substantive in terms of things that happened, but Trump said words once again. And many people have said that these words are in poor taste and are pretty much direct Nazi quotes. Calling his opponents vermin was something that has been used in the past. And I know it's just words and he says a lot of shit, but let's remember Vermin Supreme, right? He has like a boot hat. Is this going to boost his platform and campaign?
Who is Vermin Supreme?
We watched a video of him, I think. He's
back
like
in
a
the day.
joke political candidate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think if you see the video, you'll recognize it instantly. Chat, does anyone remember Vermin Supreme? Is it SF? No. What did he do? I think he showed up at some debates and stuff. Yeah, he runs for Senate. Videos such as Vermin Supreme screeches outside Athens courthouse. Oh, yes, that's what it was. He was made semi-famous because part of his platform was promising everyone a pony. The videos of him walking.
Yeah, there's always plenty of cranks in American politics.
Yeah, this guy's great because he's like intentionally leaning into the memes of how ridiculous people can be.
Best known as the crazy guy with a boot on his.
This intro walk is so good.
Hi.
Yeah, I remember they had a guy like that who ran for governor here in Texas 10 years ago or so. I don't know if you remember him. Do you remember Kinky Friedman?
No.
Yeah, his whole thing is that he knew he had no real chance of winning, but he had a joke campaign that he ran that managed to spend some decent money and get his name out. He got to be pretty well known. I don't think he changed many minds as far as who to vote for, but I think he did gain some fans.
Nice. I like candidates like that, and they make sure we keep our sense of humor about things. Pretty low shot that they actually win anything, but it can be funny commentary. But yeah, you don't really think much is happening that much, just normal Trump blowing smoke kind of thing.
I didn't even read about it.
Uh-oh.
This is the first I'd heard of it. Trump saying words, as you say, is not exactly news at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they're egregious, he would really have to outdo himself in that regard to really make it to the front page again.
Mm-hmm.
But at this juncture, it's been done.
Gotcha.
I think the media is kind of over it, so they don't really report on it as much.
That makes sense. I did see some actual news stuff that happened. People were asking about Iran had a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, and they're wondering if anything came of that or why that would be happening.
They've been talking for a while. I would assume that's the latest manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
China had a big diplomatic push, early this year or so, where they were trying to get them to talk to each other and normalize relations.
Mm-hmm.
And by and large, they failed. There's been no normalization, but they did get them to resume direct talks, which is useful. There were a couple other peripheral agreements that were signed in that vein. So, there are things that they talk about with regard to regional issues and regional ties.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't read anything to suggest there's any fundamental change in the inherently confrontational nature of their relations. That doesn't seem to be changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably they're talking about Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think anything's going to change in that regard. Because Iran has made it pretty clear that they want to kind of use it as an excuse to delegitimize Israel and try to undermine states that have normalized relations with Israel. But at least given how they've behaved thus far, I haven't seen any indication they want to escalate significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And the Saudis, for their part, would much prefer things not escalate, obviously. So I suspect they're talking about their respective positions vis-a-vis Palestine, as well as the prospects for escalation and how they could avoid that as much as possible.
Gotcha. Chat reminded me that Mohammed bin Salman is known as the bone saw based on the reporter that he had killed at the embassy, which I forgot about that. I guess that was 2018 when that happened, so 5 years ago.
Yeah, we talked about it at the time, but it has been a while.
Yeah, I forgot, because he's had a lot of PR, and he's one of the figures in the Middle East who speaks very fluent English. So he's been on a lot of TV shows and things like that, and the way that he talks, he seems like a nice guy, just listening to him talk about stuff, but nice people don't usually have other people jumped, killed, and murdered for journalism, so yeah, he's a darker figure than I remembered, but that's the power of PR and marketing, is people's attention span and memory is pretty short. I'm a good example of that in this case.
To be fair, there's been some stuff that's happened since 2018. There's been a couple other things, other world events that may have distracted you.
Yeah.
So I don't think anybody could begrudge you. Yeah, he's still pretty well known for that. The Biden administration kind of went out of its way to paint him in a bad light and to argue that it was the responsibility of the United States as a world leader to try to not alienate him, to try to marginalize him in world affairs. Mm-hmm. So they didn't really talk to him for the first year or two of the administration, and they otherwise just tried to kind of ignore him as best they could. And that didn't really work. Obviously, the war in Ukraine and other world events made it painfully apparent that some kind of direct relationship was necessary, and so relations have improved pretty markedly since then. Yeah, the Khashoggi thing was just one of those deals where a state that you're allied with does something aberrant, however that's pronounced.
Abhorrent, yeah.
Abhorrent, and you kind of have to make a judgment call about whether or not it's bad enough to warrant breaking off relations with a partner that has been a productive ally in the region. The alliance does have value. So is it worth it breaking off relations with Saudi Arabia over the Khashoggi affair? Pretty much both the Trump administration and the Biden administration said no.
Just
obviously,
for refresher, what was it that Khashoggi was posting and doing journalism about that got him so hated?
I don't think it was anything that big. I mean, I think he was basically just criticizing the regime, specifically Mohammed bin Salman. Just accusing him of authoritarianism, criticizing the crackdown on a couple feminist activists, which was a thing back in 2018 as well. So, just little things, really. It's not the kind of stuff you would think would get somebody assassinated, but apparently it was. Yeah, Khashoggi at the time actually had residency in the United States. He was living in America. So I think probably he, as well as other people, kind of assumed that he was pretty well safe. But what happened is that he traveled to Turkey, which I think is where his wife lived. He'd recently gotten married. And he had some business that he needed to take care of regarding his visa. So he had to go to the Saudi consulate in Turkey. And that was actually where they ended up getting him. It was kind of a setup. Like, they knew he was going there, and so they had a team waiting for him. And when he came in, they set upon him, basically kidnapped him, drove him away from the embassy or consulate without anybody knowing about it, and then killed him off site. Well, no, actually, I take it back. I think they killed him on site, because there actually was a recording of him being killed.
Yikes.
Bizarrely enough. Yeah, the Turkish government had bugged the embassy, basically. And they were quite happy to release the recordings in order to embarrass the Saudi government. Relations with the Saudis were not very good at the time.
Yeah, so they weren't going to cover for him.
Yeah, exactly. So the recordings were released, which is how we know that he was actually killed there. You can literally hear it happening. But yeah, he was killed on site and then dismembered on site, and then he was taken off site away from the embassy. And I don't know if they ever recovered the body. I don't think they did. But obviously there's evidence, substantive evidence, that he was killed. So nobody's hoping to, find him. Nobody's hoping that he's gonna miraculously turn up. He's very thoroughly dead at this point.
And it seems like when it comes to these sorts of situations, international law doesn't really have a global court, so you're not going to do justice to a king, basically. I know he's crown prince, but he's effectively king, because he's the one who does the administrating and talking and makes the calls and whatnot. But yeah, the world basically saw that he did that, and they're like, that was fucked up, but we can't do anything to you about it.
Yeah, pretty much. And there was some protests, a lot of wringing of hands, especially over the fact that Khashoggi had residency. That in particular kind of confused some people. A lot of people were pretending like people who have residency have some kind of entitlement to protection by the U.S. government, but that's not really the case. If you're in the United States, then yeah, if security agencies have jurisdiction over where you live, you will be granted protection. But once you go overseas, it's not guaranteed, even if you're a citizen. But having residency certainly does not obligate the United States government to protect you. You are still technically a citizen of some other country, and technically it's that other country's responsibility to ensure your safety, or at least to protect you when you're traveling overseas. So he was actually taking something of a risk traveling to Turkey. Even if Turkey didn't have good relations with the Saudis at the time, it was in close enough proximity to the Saudis that it would not have been hard, and was not hard, for them to intercept him there.
Yeah, but like you said, it probably wouldn't be something that he would expect, because that's a very severe reaction for pretty normal posts, because like the kind of things you were mentioning, people criticize people for doing that shit all the time, and nothing happens. So yeah, definitely caught him in a bad mood or something. I don't know.
Well, I think maybe what it was is that Khashoggi at the time was not publishing his articles and whatnot in a Arab publication. I think he was a contributor to the New York Times at the time. And so publishing in a major English news outlet, I think that might have garnered a lot more attention than they would have gotten otherwise. If you'd just been publishing on like a live journal online, nobody would have given a shit.
Yeah.
But the New York Times has a pretty big audience, and that's an important publication as well, because from what I was told when I was talking to a representative of the State Department who came to my college once, many moons ago, you kind of have to read the New York Times if you're working for the State Department, in a job related to diplomacy, because that's effectively the paper of record. If you're doing any kind of diplomacy, be it U.S. diplomacy or diplomacy on behalf of another government, one of the best ways to communicate, if you're not going to communicate directly anyway, if you are going to communicate through the media, pretty much everybody who does that through the New York Times. That's very common. If not the Times, then maybe the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, something like that. So given that that is an important paper for conveying information and influencing the opinions of major decision makers in government as well as out of government, if you start publishing stuff that's very critical of the government and undermining their influence in the United States, you're going to have a target on your back, especially if you're a citizen of that country, in which case the government in question is going to feel pretty entitled to deal with you how they want. And that's basically what happened with the Saudi government. So that's my guess would be that's why he got the disproportionately violent response.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the Saudis have a pretty decent PR presence, a pretty decent lobbying presence, if you prefer, in the United States. Pretty much every government does. I think you remember the Menendez scandal recently, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who got busted for bribery, where he was getting bribed by the Egyptian government with literal gold bars. So, every government that has an interest in U.S. diplomacy, which is a lot of them, generally has some kind of lobbying effort present in Washington. And they do spend a lot of money trying to influence media opinion, influencing how their country is presented in the public and influencing how important agencies and political actors think about them. So, if there's a guy running around doing the opposite, undermining your influence, making you look bad and, criticizing that's not very helpful. So there's invariably going to be pushback on that.
Chat was asking about Mohammed bin Salman and his leadership of Saudi Arabians overall, like during his tenure.
Yeah, so this is something that people don't generally understand about him outside of Saudi Arabia, because outside of Saudi Arabia, his reputation is very bad, for the very reasons that we just discussed. He just straight up murdered a guy. And Saudi Arabia in general has a negative reputation, right? It's sort of the motherland of Salafists and jihadis and sort of this austere, very repressive, old school version of Islam that is not very popular, outside of Saudi Arabia and often inside Saudi Arabia even. So, yeah, not great. But within Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman actually has a fairly positive reputation. And the reason is that he's a reformer. Right. Since he has come to office, he has not only assassinated journalists overseas, he has also he's not only engaged in the war in Yemen. I think that's the other big thing he's known for, and is another reason he has a bad reputation outside of Saudi Arabia. But within Saudi Arabia, the thing he's known for is the reform effort. Like before him, the Saudi government had a kind of de facto understanding, not quite an alliance, but an understanding with the most conservative Islamists in Saudi Arabia. They kind of had this understanding where if the Saudi government enacted very conservative, repressive laws regarding social issues, basically de facto implementing Sharia law, then they would be allowed to kind of, go unmolested, basically. So, the religious right would be able to have their way on social issues, and in exchange, the royal family would just be allowed to run the country, without incident. So that was basically the political deal that had been struck. That was done in the late 70s, by the way. It's not something that has like ancient roots or anything. Back in the 60s, the Saudi royal family was known for being kind of a party people. They would go to Europe over the weekends and spend a bunch of money, get drunk, go to the clubs, whatnot, and then leave. And obviously, that did not do much to bolster the reputation amongst their countrymen back home. So in the late 70s, there was a big revival of Islamism in the Middle East writ large. and the Saudi royal family kind of had to tone things down. They probably still do it on the down low, but they do it quietly now, where before they did not.
Mm-hmm.
So that alliance has been weakened considerably under Mohammed bin Salman. His perspective is that the country needs to modernize, and that modernization is not just economic, it also needs to be social social. I was not political. I was about to say political, but no. I haven't seen any evidence that there's any desire to modernize Saudi politics. It's going to stay an absolute monarchy. But in terms of social values, I think the perspective of Mohammed bin Salman is that if the country does want to modernize its economy, it invariably has to modernize its society, because that's about the only way they're going to be able to generate things like tourism revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they get a lot of money from people coming for the Hajj, traveling to Mecca. That's one of the main things you're supposed to do in Islam. I forget the technical term, but there's certain things that you're supposed to do as a Muslim, praying however many times a day, etc.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is that at least once in your life, if you can, you're supposed to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So every year there's a shit ton of people from all over the Muslim world that travel to Saudi Arabia for that purpose. And the Saudi government generates pretty good revenue from that. But they would like more. It's not enough revenue to carry the whole economy. And tourism is one of the industries that they're looking to develop, as weird as that may sound to those of us living in the West. And obviously, there will be some takers, but they're gonna get a lot more if they manage to liberalize the culture a little bit and make the country seem a little more friendly and open to foreigners. And just beyond tourism as well, they want to make the country a little more welcoming to foreign workers. If you're maybe familiar with the United Arab Emirates, a huge chunk of the workforce in the UAE is either immigrant labor or expats. Technically, the immigrant labor are expats too, but generally expats refers more to middle-class professionals, analysts, technical type people like that. And the UAE economy pretty much runs on those guys. And part of the reason the UAE has been able to attract a lot of those people is because it's been more tolerant. People don't mind moving there. Obviously, the money helps too. They're willing to pay out. People will overlook many indiscretions in exchange for large sums of money. But in the case of the UAE, they not only offered money, but they also made the environment relatively open. Emphasis on relatively. There's definitely still restrictions, but fewer than in Saudi Arabia. So I think the Saudis recognize that if they want to modernize their economy like the Emiratis did, some degree of liberalization is going to be necessary. And he's done it pretty slowly, but that surprises exactly nobody. Like, if you were going to try to modernize a society as conservative as Saudi Arabia, it was invariably going to be an incremental affair. It's not the kind of thing you can do with, big giant changes in a short period of time. If you tried to do it like that, you were invariably going to incur, massive backlash, probably violent. So there's been a slow drip feed over time of little reforms here and there, letting women drive, not requiring a guardian, things like that. But the reforms have been consistent. It is something that the government seems committed to doing, and that's won the government a lot of favor amongst the population, especially younger Saudi Arabians. You might think the younger folks, which, in Saudi Arabia, like everybody everywhere else, the younger folks are generally more liberal in terms of their outlook. But in Saudi Arabia, you might think that the sort of youthful liberal folks would not like the government, given how authoritarian it is, but they actually have a pretty positive impression because of this reform effort. The government's promises to try to continue this liberalization are considered credible by the people most likely to criticize the government. So that reflects well on the government overall.
So basically the TLDR is that while Mohammed bin Salman may be very barbaric and aggressive in a very old school way, the country as a whole has been like that, and he is the representation of change, even if it is connection to the old ways.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. It is an absolute monarchy with absolute power of life and death over its population. So if you're a reformer coming into that kind of government, your options are going to be limited.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I learned as a kid really early, because one of my parents' friends actually grew up in Saudi Arabia for some of her life, and that was one of the countries where she was a like European looking lady. She had to wear like the full coverings and everything. So it was one of those countries where it seemed like you can't be your normal Western self. You need to like play by their rules while you're there, which, like you're saying, with tourism and modernizing, it feels very not modern and not open if you can't wear your normal clothes and be your normal self when you go somewhere.
Yeah.
So I guess this guy's kind of the representation of that changing. And while he is potentially a villain compared to, like, well, for what the world sees him as, the people of his country see him as, okay, well, he's doing stuff different than his predecessors, so the change is good.
Yeah, if you want another example, consider that it was Mohammed bin Salman that really dramatically changed Saudi Arabia's foreign policy by actually substantively engaging in talks with Israel to normalize relations. That was very much something that he's been doing.
Mm-hmm.
The Saudis before him, not so interested. It was kind of considered something that they might do someday, but not really something they wanted to try to do in the short term. Mm-hmm. So then along comes Mohammed bin Salman, and he has actually expressed interest in normalizing relations and signing some kind of permanent peace agreement with Israel, which would be a big deal given how important Saudi Arabia is in Middle Eastern affairs. So you can't knock him for lack of ambition. Mm-hmm. Some of it's been dumb, the Khashoggi thing, and the Yemen war. That was, I predicted that would be dumb right from the start. It was pretty clear that that was going to be very intractable in nature, and that's what it proved to be. But, on the plus side of the ledger, lots of social reforms. He has made gains in terms of modernizing the economy. Oil isn't going to last forever. In general, the structure of the global economy is shifting away from oil. So a modernization of Saudi Arabia's economy is definitely much needed. And it really needs to start now. It's not something you want to have to do over a very short period of time. That's basically impossible. So, if they are going to diversify their economy away from oil, it's going to require a lot of long-term investments that are not going to pay off for like 20 years, if not longer. Mm-hmm. So, he's making the effort to plant those seeds now. And that's very much a far-sighted thing, for him to do, which is to his credit. So yeah, he deserves both reputations. He's done things to deserve both. Mm-hmm. Reputation as being sort of a authoritarian in outlook, but also I think the West doesn't give him enough credit for the things he's done on the reform side of things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's also fair to be mad at someone for dismembering and murdering journalists. So,
yeah, to be fair, we still don't actually have evidence that he ordered it, but very few analysts seem to believe that there's any way it could have happened without his approval. Mm-hmm. Just because of the structure of the government. Again, it's an absolute monarchy that's very hierarchical. In authoritarian political systems, lower level officials rarely take initiative. They almost invariably act only at the behest of superiors. Mm-hmm. So hypothetically, it's possible that Saudi Arabia's security apparatus decided on their own initiative to kill this guy, but that is not very in keeping with their established record. So most likely he did, even if it can't exactly. Most likely, that is to say, MBS did order the murder. Mm-hmm. It just can't be proven.
Right. Well, that makes sense. I did have a few other key items. There's apparently shit going on in Sudan. There's Darfur genocide in Sudan. Hundreds of people were killed, I guess, which I think that's been going on for some time.
Well, are you talking about the fighting in Sudan or the fighting in Darfur?
I wrote Darfur genocide in Sudan, so I guess there's something involving both of them. Where is Darfur
Oh
again?
yeah, Darfur is Western Sudan specifically. It was in the news a lot 20 years ago because from roughly the late 90s into the early aughts, there was a genocide happening there in which nomadic Arab militias were targeting the sedentary African population. I guess African's not quite the right term. Basically, the native population. There's nomadic Arabs who live in Darfur, and then there's basically farmers who are of a different ethnic group. And they did not get along, to put it mildly. Some of that was ecological pressure, but some of it was just expansionism. Some of the Arab militias got very aggressive because they thought that they could take more land, make money, whatever. And so they started putting pressure on these sedentary communities in order to try to eject them from their land. That conflict kind of died down in the mid-aughts, and it wasn't really on anybody's radar for a long time afterwards. And with the civil war in Sudan that started, a year or two ago, violence in Darfur has started to flare up again. Probably for a different reason this time, but the people responsible are pretty much the same. Back in the day, the Arab militia responsible for the genocide was called the Janjaweed. And after the conflict kind of died down, the Janjaweed were formalized into a sort of military force. They were not integrated into the army, which is what the army wanted to happen. Instead, they were basically given their own state-backed paramilitary organization that was called the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. And so they were kind of part of the government, but also kind of autonomous. It was always kind of ambiguous. The reason that happened is because the army was not on great terms with the president. The president was a guy named Omar, I don't quite remember. He was dictator of Sudan for a long time, but he did not have the complete loyalty of the army. Both of them kind of competed with each other for full control of the government. And because he didn't fully control the army, the president created the Rapid Support Forces to basically be his Praetorian Guard, his own personal military that was explicitly loyal to him. So, without getting into all the details, skipping ahead, the civil war that broke out a year or two ago is between the army and the Rapid Support Forces. And as you can imagine, given the history, the Rapid Support Forces have their primary base of support in Western Sudan, which again is where they originated. And since the fighting has escalated and has dragged out, the RSF has basically renewed their genocidal conflict against the native peoples of Darfur. Partly because the locals side more with the army, but probably also because they need money to pay for the war, and raiding villages and whatnot is one way to do that. So before, I think it was more about the land 20 years ago. Now it's more about the present context of the current conflict that the country is embroiled in. Yeah, we haven't talked too much about the civil war in Sudan since it started. There was some hope that maybe outside negotiators could kind of convince them to tone it down or agree to a ceasefire, but that's pretty much never happened. What ceasefires were agreed were broken in a matter of hours, so the fighting has basically been continuing without a break for the past year if not more. Have you ever heard of Khartoum?
Like Saturday morning cartoons, or
the capital of Sudan, the city of Khartoum.
Khartoum? Gotcha.
Now, there's an M at the end, Khartoum.
Oh, okay. I'm Googling it. Oh, Khartoum.
Yeah, that's the one.
Gotcha.
So that's a city of several million people, but as it happened, it's also one of the main areas, one of the main scenes of fighting in the Civil War. So the Battle of Khartoum has been ongoing effectively since the war started. and the city has taken a lot of damage, and a lot of civilians have been killed as a result. Yeah, before the war, the RSF and the army were kind of on the same side. It was basically them on one side and then civilian protesters pushing for democracy on the other. But part of the negotiations between those three factions would have involved the RSF becoming absorbed into the army and losing its independence. And the RSF didn't really like that. And so they started bolstering their forces by hiring a lot of new soldiers, building up what forces they had, and then deploying them into strategic places like the city of Khartoum. And so that kind of looked for a while like they were building up for a civil war, but people were kind of hoping maybe it was just for intimidation in order to improve their position in the negotiations. But eventually they did just outright attack the army and the Sudanese government. And so the result is that the negotiations with the civilians are just a dead letter. That's meaningless, basically. The civilians are just fodder at this point for the two combatants in the Civil War. And right now it's just a battle royale for control of the country. And it seems like it's pretty much all or nothing. It seems like they're going to keep fighting until one or the other is obliterated. That is to say, either the army or the RSF is obliterated. So because the conflict is so nasty in that regard, is so existential for both sides, and because the fighting started literally in the capital city, the civilian casualties have been very high. And it's even been very old school. It was not unusual hundreds of years ago for armies, for the leaders of armies to pay their soldiers in part through pillage. You generally had some money to pay salaries, but, the big money was when you finally took over the city you were attacking. If you could conquer a city, then you could let your soldiers run wild in the city and steal everything they could carry. And they would generally make a lot of money doing that. And that would be their reward, for their service. And there's lots of stories of armies that failed to take cities that ended up turning on their leadership because they didn't feel that they had been compensated for the effort. Now, of course, whenever a city fell back in the day, civilians kind of bore the brunt of that, generally murder, rapes, etc. But, since then, war has gotten a little bit cleaner, not entirely, but we kind of moved away from the looting of cities as a way of paying soldiers. But the reason I bring it up is because that's exactly what the RSF has been doing in Khartoum. The right to pillage, rape, and steal from civilians in the city of Khartoum, among other areas in the country, is effectively part of the pay package for the soldiers working for the RSF. And so there's been lots of terrible stories of civilians who have been suffering grievously in Khartoum since the Civil War started, correspondingly. I remember BBC Radio had an interview with a guy. He was like a middle-class dude, right? Just sort of a normal middle-class guy living in a relatively well-off part of the city. But eventually the RSF was able to push into it. And they came, they beat him, they robbed him, and then they came again, beat him and robbed him again. And then they came a third time, and when they didn't find anything to rob from him, they put a gun to his head and said they were going to kill him if they didn't tell him where his valuables are, because they were assuming that he had hidden them somewhere. And he told them, just kill me then. I don't have anything. There's nothing left to steal. And I don't really care anymore. I don't want to live like this. So, if you want to kill me, then fine. I don't care. And they were kind of taken aback by that and decided not to kill him, which is, why we had the interview. But that kind of illustrates the degree of despair and desperation there. Like, it's gotten very bad. Damn. But it's also not really getting covered. Like, the civil war in Sudan is basically back page news at this point.
Yeah, I pulled up the map on stream. It's the confluence of the White and Blue Nile rivers.
Yeah.
Is where Khartoum is. So makes sense. If it's a dry area, having your city on a river delta is pretty smart. Water is important.
Yep. Yeah, it's been the capital of various kingdoms in the region for a long time. Going back hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Was it the Kushites or something?
I think so, yeah. That was a long time. That was several thousand years ago.
Yeah, that's like the neighbors of the Egyptian Empire to the south.
Yeah, but I also remember more recently, about 140 some years ago, back before the British came into Sudan, there was an independent Muslim kingdom there. And in order to conquer it, the British had to attack Khartoum. And that turned into a big diplomatic tough. It turned into a big issue because the initial British attack did not go well. And because the locals had managed to slaughter the British attackers, the British government kind of felt compelled to retaliate by invading and conquering the country outright. The initial invasion force was not really trying to just outright conquer it. They kind of just wanted to claim it. And they were hoping a show of force would sufficiently cow the locals into just agreeing to do so. But it didn't work out. Most of them were killed, and so that led to the actual full-blown war. So Khartoum's been a while. It's definitely seen a lot of history. Unfortunately, it's been seeing quite a bit recently.
So the win condition is basically one faction beating the other, and they're going to fight each other until that happens?
That's the way it looks. I was thinking maybe over the course of the first year of the conflict, I was thinking that they would just hammer each other, and then eventually there would be peace talks. I've kind of figured the RSF was trying to use the war to improve its negotiating position, so that they could get some kind of better deal with the army. But the fighting really hasn't stopped, and there doesn't seem to have been any substantive effort to reach out and actually talk with the army. So I've had to revise my position on that. At this point, it does look like they're just trying to fight and win control of the whole country. And they met with some success. The army was bigger than the RSF. But the thing is that the RSF had much more experienced fighters, because they had been militiamen fighting out in the countryside in Darfur, off and on for decades, especially 20 years ago when the conflict was at its height. And the army, in contrast, is largely staffed with people who are just conscripts. Basically, they're just regular people who have taken up arms. So the disparity in the quality of the frontline infantry has really shown in the course of the conflict. Like, man for man, the RSF is probably the better force. And again, they were bulking up the size of their forces just before the conflict, and the army kind of didn't. So that evened the playing field in terms of the quantitative advantage that the army had. So that's not as big a factor as it would have been if the conflict had started earlier. So the advantage that the army has is they have the hardware. They've got the tanks, they've got the aircraft, etc. And so that does give them a big edge. Your infantry can be as brave as they want, but they're going to get blown up by artillery or airstrikes or whatever just as easily, regardless of how brave they are. So the army has been using that to good advantage, but they have been losing ground, last I checked. Khartoum in particular has seen pitched fighting since the conflict started, and the army has not been able to leverage their advantages into substantive permanent gains. I think a couple months ago, they even lost the major air base around the capital that they have been using they have been using to project air power, into the Battle of Khartoum. And they've also effectively lost control of Western Sudan. The RSF was already very powerful in Darfur, and so they were able to pretty quickly eject the army from most of their positions there. But over the past couple months in particular, the RSF has basically been able to completely eject the army from the western part of the country. So the way the front line is kind of panning out, it's looking like the RSF is going to have control of the west of the country, and that the army is going to have control of the south and the east of the country. And then Khartoum itself is going to just be a front line. That's kind of between those two bases of support. I'm sure people in Khartoum were hoping the war would stay out in the countryside away from the city, but unfortunately for them, they rolled snake eyes and they ended up right in the middle of it.
It's not the best outcome for them then, is it?
No. And, maybe you remember back in 2019, there was a series of protests around the world that garnered a lot of attention, like in Hong Kong, Chile, Iraq, Lebanon. There was a whole bunch of them. And Sudan was one of them. There were mass protests in Sudan at that time against the military government, specifically against President Omar. And those were successful in forcing the president to stand down. But the subsequent power sharing agreement between civilian representatives and the army obviously never went anywhere. But the Civil War basically represents, the failure of that movement, unfortunately. And that's not unusual amongst those 2019 movements. Pretty much all of them have failed at this point. Maybe you remember the mass protests in Chile?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they wanted a new constitution, right?
Yep.
And so they drew one up, and it was rejected at the polls because it was perceived as being too far left, basically. So over the past year, there's been a new constitutional convention in order to do it again. And this time, it's looking like it's going to be voted down again because it's seen as too conservative.
But the third constitution was just right.
Well, the president right now in Chile, President Boric, he's saying that if the public votes down this newest constitution, then that's going to be it. They're just going to stop trying to write a new constitution and they'll just move on.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, the polls say that the public is going to vote against it. So if that does happen, then that's going to be basically the last of the major protest movements in 2019 that had any chance of success, failing.
Mm-hmm.
Because pretty much, Hong Kong failed, obviously, Lebanon failed. There's been no substantive changes there, no substantive changes in Iraq. Sudan ended in civil war. So, yeah, all of them ended up failing over the long run. Chile and Sudan were kind of the holdouts. There was high hopes that maybe they could buck the trend, but in the end, didn't happen.
Chat saying that they should put both the constitutions into Chat GPT and take the average and accept the result. Good work.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think you're going to get many takers.
Mm-hmm. People don't like the compromise.
No, not really, unfortunately. But also, you'd probably end up with a very strange constitution if you did that.
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT is not quite so reliable as to be depended on to write a whole constitution in a consistent, coherent way.
I think they were joking, but that's true, and it's worth noting.
Yeah, I imagine, but ChatGPT, a little bit overrated at times.
Mm-hmm.
I think people in the know kind of understand its limitations, but given how sensationalist the media is, I suspect there's a lot of people that don't understand that.
There was a question in chat about Xi Jinping's visit to South Africa.
I didn't think he ended up going.
Oh, did he not?
No, there was a BRICS meeting in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I think both he and Vladimir Putin ended up not going. Which isn't that big a surprise. It's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. BRICS doesn't have a whole lot to offer China. Mm-hmm. And I don't think China's looking right now to spend a bunch of money, on a bunch of dirt poor countries, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Russia, India, etc., would love for China to spend a lot of money on BRICS that could be directed into their economies and personal little pet political projects. But in general, the trend over the past 5 years or so has been for China to reduce the amount of money it spends overseas on influence operations. People have talked a lot about the Belt and Road project, but China's actually been reducing the budget for Belt and Road over time. Mm-hmm. It hasn't really gained, spending money on Belt and Road has not really gained them very many advantages. And it's also become apparent that a lot of the countries they lend money to are not going to pay them back. Which has not particularly thrilled the foreign policy establishment in China. So yeah, yeah, it's not surprising he didn't go. I don't think it's like a big priority right now to kind of boost BRICS. They've got their own drama back home in China.
Chat said that they went and they swept up all the homeless people in South Africa. I'm not sure what that's about, but apparently that was related to Xi Jinping's supposed visit. But since he said he didn't visit, I don't know. I don't know what's going on there.
Well, I mean, it's not unusual for countries to go out of their way to try to, well, cities, I should say, to go out of their way to clean themselves up when there's a major international event happening. If you want an example of that, look no further than the Olympics, right? Lots of cities that have issues with crime and poverty and whatnot have hosted the Olympics, but while the Olympics are happening, they make sure that that's not very noticeable. You know, they go out of their way to try to put their best foot forward.
Oh, chat's saying it was San Francisco, not South Africa. I messed up. Or you messed up.
Oh, is that what it is?
Someone
Okay.
messed up, but we're saying San Francisco. Thank you for the correction, chat.
Well, there was a meeting in South Africa, and it was a BRICS meeting. And Xi Jinping did not go to that. But there is a new meeting that they're going to have in San Francisco. And that is going to be, what was it? APEC or something?
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
And chat said that is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple regional groups like that in Southeast Asia. None of them really do anything. Yeah, ASEAN and APEC, I think, are the main ones in Southeast Asia. But, you know, they talk a big game about unifying the region and doing big things. But their biggest priority is always sovereignty. And because sovereignty is their main deal, it makes cooperation very difficult because nobody is willing to make any sacrifices vis-a-vis sovereignty in order to allow for further integration in the region, which would require, you know, giving up some sovereignty. And so they talk a lot and then do very little. That is generally the defining characteristic of diplomacy in Southeast Asia. So I wasn't all that interested in the APEC meeting. I don't think anything of substance is really going to happen there. But Xi Jinping is going to go, and Joe Biden is supposed to talk with him. That's the big news there. You know, any meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping is going to be big news because, you know, meetings between the president of the U.S. and paramount leader of the Communist Party of China, that's always going to be big news. So hopefully they're able to kind of do something with that. Diplomacy between China and the U.S. has been improving over the past couple months. You know, they've been able to kind of get negotiations back on track. They're not really going to go anywhere. You know, they don't really have anything in particular to negotiate towards. The issue is more that they just want an ongoing dialogue so that they can maintain lines of communication just in case there's some incident or something that requires very rapid clarification in order to foreclose the possibility of escalation. That's definitely one of the main objectives for the U.S. And China, for its part, is probably less interested in that and more interested in just keeping the relationship quiet. You know, there's lots of drama in China right now, and so the result is that I think the party is looking to minimize the degree of foreign drama. And in that sense, they're looking to talk and just try to, if not, come to some kind of understanding in which both sides agree not to antagonize each other. At the very least, they can try to prolong talks in order to keep the United States busy so that we don't do anything too unsettling to the status quo.
So trying to keep it chill, that makes sense. There was a headline that said something about they have plans to make sure that the US and China don't use AI to control their nuclear stuff. It's like, that sounds like a no-brainer, and a chatter joke that, oh, well, that's code for China saying that they're going to start working on that immediately.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about the AI thing. My understanding was that main topics of discussion would be the economic relationship, the security relationship, and Taiwan, possibly. Taiwan was mentioned, but I'm always skeptical when the media brings it up. Because, I mean, everybody in foreign policy knows that neither the United States or China really have a lot of room to maneuver on China. That is to say, on Taiwan. And so whenever people say that, leaders of China and the United States are going to talk about it, I kind of suspect that in so much as they talk about it at all, it's basically just to reaffirm their respective positions. But otherwise, there never seems to be any substantive negotiations that could actually change the nature of the Taiwan situation. So Taiwan could be brought up, but it's probably going to be more statement of principles than actual negotiations that could result in some kind of substantive, comprehensive agreement. But yeah, economics, security, Taiwan, probably the main topics, I would guess. Maybe AI, but that seems like it would be a pretty niche topic. And I don't know that China can really credibly promise to regulate it anyway, given how their system, their whole political economy is set up. It's very decentralized. There's lots of corruption. So even if the party promised, pinky swear, not to develop this, that, or the other technology, it would probably happen in secret. If not with the party's blessing, then probably without. Yeah, I remember maybe it was like 5 years ago or so, maybe 10 years, I don't remember exactly, but there was a scientist in China that claimed to have used cloning technology to clone a child, which is kind of a no-no. You're not really supposed to do that. There's sort of rules, not really fixed rules, but there are sort of ethical restrictions that you're supposed to observe in the field that involve not using cloning technology on human embryos. Or if you do use them on human embryos, you're supposed to destroy them, something like that. But this guy said that he had, basically done in vitro fertilization of a woman with an embryo that was cloned, and she had given birth to the child. And that was pretty surprising for everybody in the field. And I think I don't think anybody was more surprised than the Chinese government itself. Even though that guy was not supposed to do that, he was able to do it anyway, under the government's nose. And given how big in China is, it's not that hard to do stuff without the government knowing about it. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but there are just so many layers of government, and those layers are so susceptible to bribery, among other forms of corruption, that you can get away with quite a bit in China if you have the right connections. So, the mad doctor in question ended up being very, very quickly detained. And I don't know if I don't know if they ended up releasing him or not. But the government did go out of its way to make clear that it did not approve of this experiment and that it did not want it happening again.
Damn, I didn't hear about any of that. I've seen lots of TV shows and stuff talking about the dangers of cloning, and I think that's one of the, I don't know, maybe generally accepted concepts of cloning humans and stuff is pretty bad or suspicious or undesirable in some way. But have you seen the movie The Island with Ewan McGregor? It's from like, I don't know, 2005 or something at this point. Kind of an old movie now.
It's 2005, a long time ago.
Is that actually what year it's from? Just randomly guessed a number.
No, you nailed it. 2005.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Okay, I'm impressed.
Well done. I guess I have not seen it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's actually kind of just asking the general question of, is it ethical to create bodies or whatever for harvesting human organs in the case that someone's organs encounter problems? Do you have a backup sort of thing? And it's not really much of a spoiler because they tell you at the very beginning of the movie, but instead of it being just like parts of someone's body, it's a fully sentient normal person who doesn't know they're a clone. And then if the person needs their organs, they just kill that person and take them. So good movie. Pretty fun.
Huh.
I don't know why it didn't take off, but yeah.
Well, sci-fi generally struggles at the box office.
Mm.
I'm guessing it was more of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah. Kind
Yeah.
of sci-fi action, I guess.
Yeah, sci-fi generally faces an uphill battle in terms of getting audiences interested. It can happen, it has happened, but in general, sci-fi movies are not like the main drivers of at the box office. Generally it's more action movies or drama. Sometimes sci-fi, rarely comedy, and then everything else is even more rare, as I understand it. It's one of the reasons you always see all the big actiony summer blockbuster movies. Those are very much what generates interest. Those are the money makers for the studios.
Makes sense.
Do you know what's his name? Ridley Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wanted to make some prequel movies for the Alien franchise. Prometheus being the most famous / notorious of them. And the studios were not really that interested, and kind of didn't really want to fund it, but they ended up funding it anyway because there's kind of a tacit understanding that if you, as a director, make the studios a whole shit ton of money, then later on in your career, they're more willing to give you money for your little pet projects. So the fact that he could not get just money genuinely and had to kind of depend on that informal norm in the industry kind of illustrates the general disinterest in the genre in Hollywood. It's not something the industry really likes doing unless somebody has like a really cool original idea that they think might actually have a chance of getting a good return on investment. Yeah, I think even after Prometheus did not do well at the box office, unfortunately. And so he had a hard time getting interest. He wanted to do a trilogy. He wanted to do 3 movies for his prequels. So Prometheus was supposed to just be the first one, but after that kind of bombed, studios were even less interested in funding the next entry. But he was able to just scrap together enough money to make it happen, and that's what became Alien Covenant. And he had to scale that down in order to get the studios to help him fund it. He also had to change it. His original vision was that it would be more like Prometheus, where it would kind of be more philosophical, more abstract and whatnot. But the studios basically told him, we're not going to do that. If you want us to fund this, you need to just make a horror movie. Give us something we can actually market. And so that's why Alien Covenant feels very different to Prometheus. It is kind of more of a traditional Alien movie, and that's very much the result of studio interference. I don't know if he's been able to get money for the third one. Probably not, given that Alien Covenant also did really badly. So I think at this point the studios have said, we've kind of repaid our debt here. We've given you all the money that we're going to give you. Thanks for making us all the money with the other movies, but we're kind of done helping you with these pet projects. So it may be that he's not going to be able to make the third one. Or at the very least, I have not heard about any progress in terms of developing the third movie. So unfortunately, his trilogy will have to go unfinished as a result, most likely.
Yeah, Prometheus, my chat was talking about, I think this last week actually, it was a drama in space more so, and the people who were on the space team had I would say, discipline and professionalism of first-year high schoolers. Like really immature characters kind of turning on each other and that kind of thing, compared to what you would consider normal astronauts to behave like. It was kind of a struggle to watch, and it didn't really get into as much of the cool backstory of the lore, but I think, like you're saying, that's because he probably planned it to be a 3-movie series. So this first movie was meant to just like scratch the surface of what all the whatever engineers or makers, the older form of people, were about, and then in the next 2 movies they get more into it. But yeah, first one didn't really do very well at all.
Yeah, it's too bad. He had some interesting ideas. Even if the movie wasn't great, I would have liked to see him flesh them out.
Hmm.
I'll forgive a lot in a movie if it has a cool premise.
Yeah. The premise is cool. I was excited for Prometheus whenever it was announced. And it did have some cool shots in it. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I always appreciate one of the consistent things about all of the movies in the Alien franchise is that they all have a pretty similar aesthetic.
mhm.
All of them have, well, obviously Geiger's influence in terms of the design of the aliens and whatnot. So that's one consistent theme. But just in the way that they design the ships, the technology, it all feels very sort of used. It's not really highfalutin. It's not like far-flung future tech. It feels very sort of lived in and homey.
Hmm.
So that aesthetic is kind of cool. I appreciate that they put work into making that look as good as it does.
Hmm. One of the things you should bug me about to work on is Kukio and I, after watching the first Avatar movie, thought up a premise for a sci-fi universe that was more grounded in science and had some ideas that aren't very well known but are established scientific facts. We called it Convergence, and it's basically about the celestial phenomenon that's going to happen in a few billion years where the Milky Way galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, and the Triangulum galaxy are all moving toward each other, and they'll entangle and basically be one big one. So yeah, lots of cool stuff you can do in sci-fi, and I think that's one of the points of frustration for some, let's say, more enthusiastic and nerdy sci-fi people is horror concepts of aliens jumping out and killing people. That's not really giving you the story and the background that you want as a sci-fi enjoyer. That's just action stuff that's happening. But there are a lot of really cool celestial phenomena that can happen. And then sometimes with a movie like Interstellar, they just go fantasy with it and go to different dimensions and stuff that isn't strictly scientific, but it can be artistic and cool with how it looks in a movie.
Yeah, I remember you guys talking about that.
Mm-hmm. I found my old notes for it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I did a sketch of one of the types of alien creatures. Made a few different factions and stuff. The Avatar movie we were like amazed by from a visual spectacle, but the story is kind of like recycled dead fish. It's basically Pocahontas in space. They didn't experiment with a single unique idea in the whole thing. So in that sense...
Have you ever seen a movie called Dances with Wolves?
Yeah. It's also that, very similar to Dances with Wolves.
Yeah.
When it comes to like huge budget projects, I could see how people who are making it would want to be risk averse when it comes to story and be like, all right, we're putting a whole bunch of money into very advanced tech and cinematics and stuff for this movie, so we don't really want to risk it with a weird plot. So just like Dances with Wolves, slap a new skin on it. We already know that that story worked, so we'll release it again.
Yeah, John Carpenter is similar to Ridley Scott in that he has a lot of residual capital, shall we say, with the studios because of all the money he made them back in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he did for a long time was deep sea documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
Like for about 10 years, like he really just did not make movies. He just made documentaries about the deep sea, maritime research, stuff like that. And it wasn't until he had this idea for Avatar. Well, more specifically, he had the idea for Avatar, but he also had a bunch of new ideas regarding technology that he wanted to try out. And Avatar was basically the vehicle by which he would test out those technologies and actually implement them to see, what kind of innovative new approaches to cinema, to filmmaking that he could do, that he could accomplish. And so he brought that to the studios, and the studios thought, well, that sounds very expensive, but you've already made us a bunch of money, so we're going to kind of pay you back, we're going to observe that informal norm that I talked about, and we're going to help you fund this. And unlike Ridley Scott, though, when John Carpenter's pet project actually hit the screen, it made a shit ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so the studios were like, hey, you want some more money?
Yeah.
Your pet project has exceeded our expectations. If you want more, feel free. And so they cut a deal to make, what was it? They cut a deal to make like 5 Avatar movies.
Chat's saying that it's James Cameron, not John Carpenter.
James Cameron, thank you. Keep me honest, chat. Keep me honest.
Thank
Something
you,
that started with a C. But yeah, the studios were so grateful that they actually cut a deal to make a whole bunch more of these movies. And, he of course was delighted, and he's been making them for like 10 years now.
Did you see the second one?
I have not seen the second one. Have you?
Yes.
How is it?
It's
All right, just kind of.
It's all right. Yeah, it almost in some way, and chat, feel free to weigh in, but it seems kind of like maybe a less grand story than the first one, just in terms of the final battles and stuff. And they recycled the same bad guy from the first one, which kind of feels like a lack of imagination, but not quite sure on that. Yeah. Felt a little bit like new Star Wars, where it's like, we can't think of a good villain. Let's get Palpatine out there again. Come on, dude. You got this.
He came back somehow.
Yep. Oh no, Palpatine is back.
Yeah, I really loved that the new Star Wars trilogy basically perfectly encapsulates like the very essence of studio interference in the creative process.
How was it interfered with?
George Lucas did not want to sell Star Wars for a very, very long time, specifically because his expectation was that if he did sell the franchise, then the studios would just kill it. They would just pump out Star Wars movies just to make money, but they wouldn't put in any of the creativity or innovation that he put into the movies, which made them really special. So his thinking was that they would make movies that would make some money, they would look good, but they wouldn't have any soul. They wouldn't have any of that original spark.
That's really what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
That's the thing. This is studio Star Wars that we have in the new trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially funny for me because I'm old enough to have seen all of this play out like over the full scope of time, right? I remember I didn't see the original Star Wars in studio, right? But I grew up with them. So that was like the perfect mix of George Lucas crazy and studio interference, right? Because he didn't make the original trilogy without studio interference. There was definitely some. And if you look back on the things that the studios were suggesting, they were actually pretty good ideas. Studio interference back then with the original trilogy was not about, doing things just for the money or just for the sake of it. They were mostly focused on restraining George Lucas's more outlandish instincts. There's a whole documentary about it, online. Some of the stuff he wanted to do was kind of crazy, kind of cringe. So perfect balance there between studios and George Lucas's creativity. And then you get the prequel movies where there's no studio interference. Star Wars was his baby at that point, and he made those prequel movies exactly how he wanted to make them. And the results speak for themselves, right? They're very creative. They're very innovative. They were revolutionary in a lot of ways, technologically speaking, in terms of the filmmaking. But in terms of things like plot, acting, presentation, there's a lot of issues there. And that's well-trodden ground by now. That's not like a hot take. I think everybody is aware of the limitations of the prequel trilogy. But a lot of that just stems from George Lucas being George Lucas. The absence of studio interference hurt the prequel trilogies. And so with the sequel trilogies, we have the culmination of the project. We have no George Lucas, all studio interference. And the results there speak for themselves as well. They look great, the acting is good, but there's something missing. Like the creative side of it is the weakest part of the sequel trilogy, I would argue. So in a sense, whether you like, the sequel trilogy or the prequel trilogy or whatever or not, you have to admit that it's perfect. It's the perfect way for all 3 trilogies to play out. because it's the perfect natural experiment to see just what George Lucas added to the franchise and what the studios added to the franchise. I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Perfectly balanced.
Yeah, as all things should be.
Too much interference, too little interference, and just the right amount of interference.
Exactly. So we've strayed pretty far from.
Yeah, this is a movie conversation now.
I guess you continuously tie it to economics, because I was kind of talking about the business side of the industry.
Yeah.
So I could justify it in that sense. We really don't talk economics very much on here, but that is sort of one of our core competencies. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't come up much. People are a lot more interested in bloodletting in Israel-Palestine than they are in whatever's going on in the latest data release from the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, true.
So I can't really blame them for that.
Man, yeah, I was actually a little bit tilted during last week's world discussion, because there were a lot of people in my chat who are normally very like chill, balanced, level-headed chatters just getting really upset. And I was like, guys, can we calm down? It was not possible. So I know it's a very hot button issue. People have their opinions and they hold them very strongly. The propaganda that's served to people is also very strong. And I've noticed that a lot of people just on social media and that kind of thing are pressuring others to take a side, mm-hmm. which is a interesting state of affairs.
Well, you know, both the Palestinians and the Israelis are very good at getting their conflict into the media. That's something both sides do because they see it as a core part of the struggle, mm-hmm. Given the influence and importance of international actors in support for one or the other side. Mm-hmm. So perhaps not surprising that it has disproportionate exposure internationally, mm-hmm. But there definitely are other conflicts going on. You know, Burma still has its civil war, for example, but that hardly ever gets talked about. Mm-hmm. Sudan civil war, you know, that we just talked about, like very little coverage of that, despite way more people dying in that conflict than in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Was there still stuff going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, or is that basically played out by now?
Oh, yes. Yes, there is stuff.
Oh.
Did I maybe I mentioned it. Did I mention the territory that had its entire Armenian population de facto expelled?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, yeah. So we did talk about that then. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the most recent development. That was the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Republic of Artsakh, you know, whatever you prefer to call it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a big push by the Azerbaijani military to basically take what was left of it, and the Republic of Artsakh forces ended up surrendering because they basically just had no chance. They were already cut off before the conflict even started, because the previous conflict had ended with the Azerbaijani military in charge of the corridor, that is to say the roadway that connected Artsakh with Armenia. And being cut off from Armenia meant that they had been cut off from any supplies. In fact, the Azerbaijanis had already started a blockade that had cut off both the Republic of Artsakh military and its civilian population from outside resupply, which was having increasingly dire effects on the economy and the well-being of the civilian population. So they were in a bad state before the conflict resumed, and when it did, they knew they didn't have a chance, and so they ended up agreeing to surrender. Mm-hmm. And technically, the Azerbaijan government has not expelled the population, but pretty much nobody expects to be treated fairly under the Azerbaijan government. And so there's been a mass exodus from the territory. I think something like 90% of the Armenian population has now left.
Damn.
So a big win for Azerbaijan, big defeat for Armenia. The biggest losers are, of course, the people who have been displaced. The Armenian government is trying to help them out, but, you know, it's not a particularly wealthy government, so resources are limited. There's been some rumors about Azerbaijan perhaps continuing to attack Armenia. which would be very bold. With Nagorno-Karabakh, the territory they'd been fighting over, it was internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. So legally speaking, they were in the right to take the territory back. Technically, perhaps not particularly ethical the way that they did it, but legally it was part of Azerbaijan. But now that they have it back, any further aggression would be just, well, exactly that. It would be outright aggression. There's no legal reason for Azerbaijan to continue hostilities against Armenia, but that could possibly happen if the rumors are true. Basically, the rumor is that Azerbaijan might try to seize the Zangezur corridor, which is the piece of Armenian territory that separates Azerbaijan from an enclave of Azerbaijan that actually sits west of Armenia. So if the Zangezur corridor were seized, then Azerbaijan would have a direct land bridge to that enclave. I believe the enclave is called Nakhchivan, something to that effect. So that's a possibility. I don't think it's all that likely. I don't think they really have that much to gain by it. It's not as though Armenia contests Nakhchivan. It's majority Azeri anyway. And even at the height of the fighting over the past 20 years, nobody was contesting it. I don't think there's ever been any substantive fighting in Nakhchivan. So I don't think they'll do it, but it is possible. It could be that the Azerbaijan government is sufficiently ambitious enough to try it. So that is something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's one of the fun realizations, which is that there's more than just front page news. There's back page news. I know you've noticed a lot of conflicts that are potentially no less bloody than the ones on the front page news, just aren't as pushed to the front based on how they're reported.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, keep in mind the conflict in Gaza is super small. I don't doubt the fighting is ferocious, but in terms of scale, in absolute terms, it's very small.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Gaza Strip itself, you could probably drive it in 20 minutes, maybe less than that. It's not much. People have been, one of the things that I've seen in the news is that people have been commenting that the war in Gaza is a big problem for Ukraine because Israel is requesting military aid from the United States to help them with the conflict in Gaza. And so the logic is that all of that military aid is being diverted from Ukraine. It could be going to Ukraine and helping them, but instead it's eating into those resources that might have otherwise been directed to them. So in that sense, the war in Gaza could be said to undermine Ukraine's war effort. But I don't really think that's true. And maybe I'm wrong on this. Actually, this would be a good point for a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased on here, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is very much encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I always go through it after we're done in order to get the feedback and whatnot. So we definitely do enjoy feedback here of whatever kind is on offer. So that said, I don't think Ukraine is really harmed by the conflict in Gaza in terms of the foreign aid that it receives from the United States. And the crux of my argument there is just that Gaza and the conflict in Gaza is kind of too small to really impact flows to Ukraine that much. Just the sheer amount of shells and munitions being used is not that big compared to the equivalent usage in Ukraine. And I would point out, too, that the types of munitions being used in Gaza are different than the munitions that Ukraine generally uses. Israel leans really heavily on air power. And in turn, they tend to rely on things like GPS-guided bombs and smart missiles, things like that. But in Ukraine, air power is not as relevant. In general, neither Russia nor Ukraine has been able to has been able to control the skies. And the result is that air power is very restricted in the scope to which it can be used in the conflict. In so much as it's been used at all, generally it's used very briefly, very close to the front line. It's sufficiently difficult to penetrate deep into the other side's air defenses that it generally doesn't happen. What will happen is that if it's a fixed wing aircraft, it'll take off behind, way in safe territory, and then it'll fly low to the front line, and then it'll pop up and, maybe lob some rockets, attack whatever targets in the area very briefly. It'll attack very briefly, and then it'll dive back down and return to base. Because if it lingers at all for any length at a time, invariably the opponent's surface-to-air missile systems are going to lock onto it and shoot it down. In fact, generally, while the aircraft is attacking, they actually are attacked. Generally, the missiles are fired, even during the brief window when they are attacking. And so that makes it necessary for the aircraft to just turn around and fly off in order to preserve itself. And sometimes even then that doesn't work. So the usage of fixed-wing aircraft faces a lot of limitations. It can happen, it does happen, but it's very risky. And an aircraft can only be on station just very briefly, which limits the amount of damage that they can do. Helicopters have a little more scope from what I was reading, just because they can be launched much closer to the front line. So they can pop in, provide air support and then leave relatively quickly without endangering themselves too much. So more relevance there, but the trouble with helicopters, of course, is that they're much more vulnerable to short-range surface-to-air missile systems or even just to ground fire, things like gunfire. So they take on a different set of risks, when they're engaged in combat. So just in general, my point here is that air power, is important to the war, but it's not being used as much. And so the munitions that Ukraine requests kind of reflects that fact. Generally they're requesting more things like artillery shells, cruise missiles, smart missiles, things like that. Not necessarily the kinds of stuff that you would launch from an aircraft, like, say, a GPS-guided bomb, which is what Israel is mostly using in Gaza, and which is probably what they're requesting from the U.S. government right now. So the fact that Gaza is just a much smaller conflict, and the fact that Israel is using a different variety of munitions than what is generally the norm in Ukraine, I think, in general, both of those factors combined mean that there's not really that much pressure being brought on Ukrainian foreign aid by the war in Gaza.
Gotcha. So that's just propaganda, trying to get people to believe certain stuff. There was one article that I saw saying that there was a group of Ukrainian prisoners of war who were going to be deployed to fight against their own people soon, like by Russia.
Yeah, I think I saw that headline earlier, but I hadn't read the article.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, regardless of circumstances.
Have you seen Braveheart?
I actually have not seen it.
What? Okay, well, I was telling Chad earlier that there's a scene in Braveheart. I guess it's a spoiler. I'm trying to wonder if it's like worth it for you to watch it at this point. Some people like it, some people don't. It's not the most accurate telling of William Wallace, but whatever. Basically, there's a point where the British deploy the Irish to go fight the Scottish, and when the Irish are charging over to go attack the Scots, they just go over there and hug them and give them handshakes, and they're friends and stuff. So that's what it made me think of, was they're just gonna run out there and they're like, we're gonna make you fight your own people, and they're like, okay, well, I guess. Then they just go over there and rejoin their bros.
Huh. Yeah, I think that's there could be a similar dynamic there if Russia starts trying to mobilize a bunch of Ukrainians. I don't think it really ends well for them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they could use them as shock troops or something, like with a penal battalion, but like even then, the efficacy is going to be pretty limited.
What's a penal battalion? Oh, like a jail battalion.
Yeah, like taking prisoners and impressing them into service.
Gotcha.
Russia has been doing a lot of that since the conflict started.
Yeah, Terrans do that as well.
Yeah, with the Marines.
Yep.
Yeah, in my defense, I think I did try to watch it at one point when I was a kid, but I think I fell asleep
That's fair.
at one point. So I actually have seen the ending
Oh,
because I woke up before that.
oh, okay. Well,
Yeah, but the middle part is more what I'm fuzzy on. Yeah, I've seen the ending to Braveheart and the ending of Fight Club, but I haven't seen anything else in either movie.
that's funny.
Yeah, I remember seeing the ending to Fight Club and thinking, if I'd been watching the rest of the movie, I would probably find that very interesting.
I think there was
I think
one other. Go ahead.
I think we have some questions.
Yeah, Fuzzy Cord's been taking some, so if you see some, fire away.
Let's see. What's your political forecast for the Eastern Europe Baltic region and its countries in the near future with regards to the war with Russia and USA's further involvement and interest in the region in case of change of government? Yeah, I think somebody asked something similar last time. I would differentiate between Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe, because Ukraine is kind of a uniquely, major issue. Well, kind of made it's. People pretend to care a lot about it, but it's actually kind of fallen out of the headlines a little bit. So I don't know that people are really talking about it as much now. But the people who do talk about it kind of pretend that it's a very important issue that people really dramatically care about, and that we need to do this, that, or the other thing. Either a lot more support to Ukraine or significantly cut support to Ukraine. But I think there was a poll done asking people what their top issues were right now in politics, and invariably it was economic issues. Basically, cost of living stuff. That seems to be like the dominant issue for most people. And Ukraine was like a fourth, fifth ranked type thing. It's not really as important in the politics as it was last year. But that hasn't stopped people from trying to leverage it. Trying to make it an issue. So there are a lot of people who say that we should cut aid and whatnot. So that could happen. If there is a change of government, there could be a significant change in how in the degree of support that the United States is willing to provide. But that said, the rest of Eastern Europe might as well exist on the other side of the moon as far as U.S. politics is concerned. I don't think most people here can name hardly any countries in Eastern Europe. If they could, it would be a guess. It is not on the political radar right now. So in the case of foreign relations and foreign policy relevant to Eastern Europe generally, other than Ukraine, I don't think a change in government is going to impact that at all. It'll probably just be status quo, most likely. Now, you could argue that Ukraine itself is relevant to Eastern Europe. Obviously Poland and the Baltic states care a lot about Ukraine right now. So if the United States had a change of government and significantly curtailed its support to Ukraine, Eastern European governments, specifically Poland and the Baltic states, would probably complain about it. But I think they would also know that complaining about it wouldn't really change anything. We're really talking about a prospective Trump administration here. So, if Trump is reelected, I don't think anybody's going to have any delusions about the likelihood of changing his mind about something like Ukraine. Either he's going to significantly cut aid if he wins re-election, or, well, I guess there's three possibilities. Either he cuts aid, or he maintains aid because Congress forces him to some degree, or he maintains aid because he strikes some kind of quid pro quo with either perhaps congressional backers or with Ukraine itself, in which Ukraine would give him something that he wants in exchange for a continuation of the status quo. Yeah, kind of like what I said last time when we were talking about this. It's not inevitable that the Trump administration would cut aid to Ukraine. It would just depend on these other factors. It would depend on Ukraine. It would depend on Congress, etc. Probably he'll end up cutting aid just because that's the popular thing to do, but he's also known for being very transactional, so it's entirely possible that he could be bought in that regard. So Eastern Europe would complain if he tried to cut aid, but they wouldn't really be able to change his mind, I think, unless they were able to buy him off somehow. And I don't know that they have anything to really offer him that would be sufficient. So yes, a change in government could lead to substantive change vis-a-vis American foreign policy involving Ukraine, but I don't think it would really impact U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Eastern Europe other than Ukraine at all. That would be my judgment, just given how politics in the U.S. are right now. Yeah, people just don't think about Eastern Europe much in the U.S. I mean, in so much as we've thought about it at all since the war in Ukraine started, it's been the most attention the region has gotten since the Cold War ended, easily. Mm-hmm. But you can already see the attention span starting to fade, you know. People are kind of moving on to other things. There's still a lot of people that think it's an important issue, especially up in Washington, but the general public seems to be getting tired of it. You know, there is a sentiment. I think there's even polling now that shows that most Americans, something like 55 to 60% or so, think that the U.S. has sent enough money, quote unquote, to Ukraine. So that doesn't mean people don't still want to support Ukraine. I think in general, Ukraine is still fairly popular, and people do want the government to help them. But it seems that people would prefer to keep the money. Mm-hmm. And if it sounds contradictory that most people want to help Ukraine at the same time that most people want to stop sending money, that's actually not unusual. That's exactly the kind of contradictory position that's pretty normal amongst the regular going public. A lot of people want to have their cake and eat it too.
Welcome, raiders of two streams. Heaven SC and Trisha Payne raided us back to back. Appreciate you. We are doing a live conversation with a friend of mine from college. We're talking about the world. We call it World Discussion. We do this on Sundays. So anything that is history or news or economics related, we are down to talk about. We don't necessarily have the correct answers to everything, but if you want to weigh in or ask a question, feel free.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Some people throwing out their hot takes.
Yeah, the raids are always fun because there's always some people that have no idea what's happening that are just parachuted in.
Yes. What are they talking about here? What podcast is he listening to? No, it's a person.
Yeah, if I ever don't answer the question correctly, or if maybe I just missed the point of the question, feel free to ask again and I'm happy to return to it. But yeah, I wouldn't expect any substantive changes for Eastern Europe. You know, it's just not something people here care about, which is unfortunate because it's a very interesting region. Southeastern Europe in particular is a very happening place. Mm-hmm. But Northeastern Europe definitely also has its charms. Probably the most successful part of the region in that case. Let's see. Do I have any comments on Australia offering to absorb all of Tuvalu's population in the event it goes underwater? Yeah, I think I did see that story. It'll probably be a while before it ends up underwater, I think. So I don't know that Australia will actually end up having to be held to that agreement.
It's a nice gesture.
Yeah, it's a nice gesture. Yeah, Tuvalu. Let me think here. Tuvalu. Which one is Tuvalu? Was that New Hebrides? No. No, that was the part of Kiribati that broke off, wasn't it? Am I crazy?
Sorry, Kiribati, what?
Kiribati is you know how there's a lot of archipelago countries in the Pacific, like just a bunch of islands all together? Micronesia, that's probably the most famous one, right? Mm-hmm. Kiribati is one of those, and it's a Central Pacific country. The southwestern chunk of islands that were part of Kiribati actually broke off from Kiribati and became their own country. And I think Tuvalu is that. Yeah. I keep making this mistake of coming to Google Maps to look at Pacific Island nations, and it does not work. You can't see them on the map.
A viewer from New Zealand that we have said a big important thing for the Australian deal is in exchange Australia gets veto powers in the defensive decisions that Tuvalu makes, so China is big mad.
I had not heard about that. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that China would be big mad about it. China doesn't really care about the Pacific all that much.
China is little mad.
Yeah, China has been trying to expand its influence in the Pacific, but I don't think anybody in China's foreign policy establishment has high expectations in that regard. Because the United States and Australia have a lot of influence. It's going to be pretty hard for them to kind of shoulder in to the region at this point. Which is not to say they haven't made gains. They have, but, most of a lot of countries are de facto part of the United States, even. What do they call those? Association agreements. Obviously, the Northern Marianas is an actual territory of the United States, but Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau actually have special treaties with the United States that give the United States control and responsibility for their foreign policy and defense. Well, maybe not foreign policy, but certainly their defense. And that, of course, gives the U.S. a lot of influence there. What is it? Free compact?
Free association states.
That sounds right. I think that's it. Compacts of free association. There we go. So China can't really penetrate there. They kind of had an opportunity, because those agreements actually expired last year and they have to be renegotiated. But the United States, I believe, has successfully renegotiated, has negotiated extensions to two of them and is in the process of doing the third right now. So China's probably not going to be able to make much headway there. And that's kind of a critical area because those island countries are sort of closer to China. And that first island chain of defense, as the Chinese military calls it. Mm-hmm. And then Australia has a lot of influence in Papua New Guinea, I believe. I think somebody pointed out in chat, I think somebody from Australia pointed out in chat a couple weeks ago that I was weaker on Oceania. And that's true. You guys do not come up in the news very often. So I don't get nearly as much exposure to developments there. But yeah, my understanding is that Australia has a lot of influence with Papua New Guinea. Mm-hmm. And the Solomon Islands kind of had a thing with China. They signed a treaty. Well, not even a treaty. It was just an agreement, basically. But I think that was kind of overblown. It was definitely worth reacting to. The United States, if not also Australia, have definitely not done enough in the region in order to kind of maintain their influence. So that was a nice wake-up call. But that said, if you actually look at the agreement itself and the details, it did not really represent like a giant leap forward for Chinese influence in the region. I don't think Fiji is really in anybody's sphere of influence. They kind of got their own thing going on. It's one of the larger island nations in the region, and I think they generally try to exert their own influence to a limited degree.
Through bottled water.
Is that even from Fiji?
I don't know, but it's great branding if it is.
I think that's an American company. Oh, no, it is from Fiji. Okay. It is news to me.
It comes from a sustainable, ancient artesian aquifer deep within the earth. Wow. I didn't know there were artesians down there in that aquifer. It's protected and preserved naturally from external elements. That's cool.
Huh.
They also have a very beautiful flowery decor on the side of the water bottle, which increased the excitement when you purchase it.
It's good marketing, I grant you that.
Yeah.
Well, as far as I know anyway, I don't believe that Fiji water is a major player in the political economy of Fiji or in the region generally.
It's relatively good water as far as bottled water goes, so they have that going for them.
Oh, wait a minute. That's not what I wanted. Yeah, Tuvalu is the
Tuvalu.
country that broke away. Huh?
Tuvalu.
Tuvalu, thank you.
Yeah.
Tuvalu is the country that broke away from Kiribati. Yeah, there's a couple south of it that I was confusing it with. Yeah, sometimes I get Tuvalu mixed up with Tonga because they kind of have similar sounding names.
Mm-hmm.
And then Vanuatu also kind of sounds similar to me, so sometimes that kind of messes me up as well. Yeah, I think I made a map for you that you showed on stream at one point that kind of showed the spheres of influence in the region and just how much of them are dominated by the United States and Australia, if not also the British and the French. There's not a whole lot of room there for China to kind of move in. I think maybe Fiji, Tonga, and Vanuatu are probably the best candidates there. I think I did read that China made some headway with Tuvalu, but I imagine that it would not be too difficult for the U.S. to offset that influence.
Mm-hmm.
Nauru, yeah, Nauru is also there. Pretty sure Nauru is pretty thoroughly in the Australian sphere of influence, though, so I wouldn't worry about them. Let's see. Yeah, thank you for mentioning the strategic side of that agreement with Tuvalu. I had not been aware of that. I'm going to have to read more about that. I think I saw the headline about Australia agreeing to take people in, and I kind of brushed it off. Didn't really think it would change things that much in the region, but if Tuvalu is surrendering its foreign policy to them, that's a different matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, how often would they actually have to make defensive decisions like that?
Probably not very often. It's a pretty quiet region overall.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Do you see a path to peace that is not a two-state solution regarding Gaza? Assuming a two-state solution, what is needed to happen to allow for a solution? Is there something other than a two-state solution? Yeah, the status quo. The status quo is the solution. In fact, that's probably what's going to happen. You know, I'm already on record on here as saying that by this time next year, the conflict between Israel and Palestine will probably have reset to the pre-October raid status quo. Yeah, I don't think it's going to change anything fundamental in the conflict that's actually going to change the trajectory
And then
right now.
For context, the pre-October raid state would be more or less just like random missiles shot from one side to another, random terror attacks.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the Israelis had done a pretty thorough job of containing the threat from the Palestinians, but it was also going out of its way to avoid the peace process quite deliberately in order to allow further expansion of settlements.
Mm-hmm.
And because there was no progress on the peace process, the Palestinians were only ever becoming more and more radical. And so invariably there would be intermittent terrorist attacks, or generally more like rocket attacks. Generally don't see too many terrorist attacks too much anymore in Israel, but Hamas would fling a couple dozen rockets, somewhere at Israel in retaliation for some perceived slight or offense or something. Mm-hmm. I think over the past couple of years, it's generally involved stuff involving the Al-Aqsa Mosque over in Jerusalem. So the conflict generally is pretty passive. There's low-level violence, certainly, especially at the West Bank between settlers and Palestinians. But people don't pay much attention to that generally. Rather, what happens generally is that the conflict is quiet, and then there will be a flare-up every couple of years. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think Hamas or whatever other radical group responsible for it generally actually expects much to change. Generally, they're just engaging in their own politics. Politics in Palestine is the politics of resistance. Whoever is able to prove that they're able to resist the occupation the most, or is at the very least the most willing to be proactive in challenging it, generally they get more political capital. They get more support. Mm-hmm. And so you generally see acts of violence that incur disproportionate retaliation from the Israelis that, while destructive, does not deter future violence, because the cause of the violence was not any, desire to actually challenge or, overthrow Israeli control of the West Bank. It was just politics. I want to lob some rockets at Israel to show that I'm brave and that you should support me and my faction in Palestinian politics. And the Israelis, for their part, were pretty comfortable with that status quo, too, because it meant that they could continue settling land while ignoring the peace process, which they didn't really have much faith in to begin with. So, yeah, everything is pretty tightly managed. Occasional flare-ups when political circumstances necessitate it. And then there's some kabuki theater where there's retaliation and then acrimony, and then everything goes back to normal for another couple months or years.
So basically what you're saying is there are parties on both sides that benefit from the violence staying.
For sure. Absolutely. I mean, if you're a settler party that believes that there's no such thing as Palestine and that Judea and Samaria belongs inherently to Israel, then the peace process is a threat to you, because it would probably mean that you would not get the land that you are rightfully entitled to by word of God, right? The settlers are very religious. They believe that God granted them that land and that it's their destiny to get it back. So they've not only been resistant to the peace process, they have multiple times over the course of the conflict actively sabotaged it. I was actually watching a Frontline documentary a couple days ago about the Oslo Accords. Mm-hmm. Well, about the Oslo Accords, the aftermath, and then more specifically, the Camp David talks in 2000. It was really about the Camp David talks, but they also did a lot of background stuff to kind of give you context. Frontline is pretty good about that. I would actually strongly recommend it for you. I think you would find it very informative. I'll send you the link after we're done. It was a pretty good documentary. Cool, but anyway, one of the things that happened after the Oslo Accords is that the agreement started to break down. There were issues with compliance by this, one side or the other. And, at the height of the talks, when they were trying to salvage the agreement and trying to come back to the table and get everything back on track, there was a right-wing Israeli politician named Ariel Sharon, who actually went out of his way to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Specifically, I think it was the Wailing Wall. And he was not supposed to do that. It wasn't, there were rules allowing people to go to the Wailing Wall, but for a high-level right-wing Israeli politician to do it at all was inherently controversial. For him to do it during a sensitive stage in the peace talks, when both sides were trying to prove their credibility and good faith, was especially inflammatory. And, I can't prove it per se, but he would have known what the effect would be. And the effect was mass protests, violence against Jews at the holy site, violence against Jews in the rest of Palestine, and then retaliation from the Israeli government. And then both sides at that point found it very difficult to continue the talks. And while they did try, ultimately they faltered. And that eventually paved the way for Netanyahu and Likud to come to power in the 1996 elections. And there's a lot more to that story, but in general, that's a good example of the kind of sabotage that the right wing, specifically Likud, and others that are very ambitious in terms of their territorial ambitions. That's an example of the kind of shenanigans they get up to with regard to the peace process. And of course, the Palestinians have equivalents, right? There are radicals in Palestine who will settle for nothing less, or at least claim to not be willing to settle for anything less than full right of return. They want all of the Palestinian refugees and their descendants to be able to travel back to their original villages and hometowns, which are that they were expelled from in Israel, or at least what is now Israel. And that, of course, would present a demographic problem for Israel, which wants to be a quote-unquote Jewish state. And, if it's 50-50, one or the other, or maybe even Muslim majority, that's kind of hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
Hypothetically, you could, if everybody had equal rights and there was a liberal constitution and everybody agreed to behave themselves, but we're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has probably around a century of intermittent communal violence under its belt at this point. So nobody in Israel, if not also in Palestine or outside of the region, has much faith in a possible one-state solution, or more specifically, has much faith that a one-state solution would be able to be implemented in a way that did not result in violence between the two communities. Invariably, there's a lot of people that would want peace, but the whole issue with the conflict, as you stated, is that there are spoilers. There are violent radicals on both sides that don't want the peace. Mm-hmm. And if you force those violent radicals together in a one-state solution, it should not surprise anybody that they would kill each other. Mm-hmm. Like, invariably, that's exactly what they would end up doing. That's exactly what they did end up doing back when they were integrated, back before Israel even existed. Back in the 1920s and 30s, when it was a British Mandate territory and the British were allowing Zionists to move into the territory, there was still a lot of overlap between the communities. And invariably, when tensions rose because of the immigration that the British Mandate government was allowing, there was violence between them. When the Arabs thought that the British government was disproportionately favoring the Zionists, they rose up. They committed acts of violence against both the Jews and the British government. And when there was a big revolt in 1936 by the Arabs and the British government shifted weight towards the Arabs and started restricting immigration, then it was the Zionists that started engaging in violence, targeting both the Arabs and the British government. So, communal violence in an integrated society between them is not only likely in the event of a one-state solution, it's precedented. That's what happened before. And I don't really see much reason not to expect it again, given that exactly the same violent radical factions responsible for the violence back then, in the 1920s or 30s, are still present now. Like Likud itself, as well as other right-wing groups in Israel, are directly descended from radical right-wing militias in Israel, in the British Mandate territory of what would become Israel, that committed acts of violence against Arab civilians, Arab villages, etc. They're still there, and they're just as ambitious now as they've ever been.
So it goes, it seems.
Yeah. So the conflict, when they ask, is there a path to peace that does not involve a two-state solution? Probably not. Is there a path to peace that involves a one-state solution? Probably not. I don't see that as being likely. But is there an alternative to the two-state solution? Yeah, like I said, the status quo. And if that sounds crass, keep in mind that that is the most likely outcome. Mm-hmm. Like, of all of the commentary from analysts that I've seen, and just based off of my own study of the conflict, it seems extremely likely that they're just going to reset after the current round of fighting is done, and they're just going to go back to business as usual. Mm-hmm. So that's neither a one-state nor a two-state solution. You could argue it's not even really a solution, but keep in mind it was a status quo that both factions, specifically both radical factions and on both sides, were fairly comfortable with. Even if they weren't exactly getting everything they wanted, they were quite willing to work with that status quo, especially if it meant that more moderate factions in both sides were being denied political power, which is what the radicals really want. So let's see, the second part of the question was, assuming a two-state solution, what is needed to happen to allow for a solution? Well, okay, what would you need to allow for a two-state solution? You would need a lot. First and foremost, you would have to get rid of the spoilers who would try to sabotage and undermine it at virtually every opportunity. That's not going to happen. I mean, Israel, for its part, has a liberal constitution, right? It's a liberal democracy, so the government doesn't really have the ability to just identify groups that it doesn't like and throw them in jail or disenfranchise them. And effectively, that's what they would have to do if they wanted to stop the radical factions in Israeli politics from exerting their influence and pushing the government into ever less conciliatory positions vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue. So that can't really happen. And then for the Palestinians, they don't really have a central authority that's even capable of reining in the radicals. One of the main problems over the course of peace negotiations in the 1990s and aughts is that even when the Palestinian Authority genuinely wanted peace talks and genuinely wanted to make progress, there would be radical factions, up to and including Hamas in particular, that would go out of their way to sabotage those talks. And the Palestinian Authority just didn't have the capacity administratively, in terms of its police forces, in terms of its security forces, et cetera, to rein them in. They couldn't do it. In so much as they took action against them, they had to do it with Israeli help. And you can imagine how that looks in Palestinian politics. Not good.
Yeah, you're saying that it's basically at a state now where any attempt to find common ground or to go for a diplomatic victory is seen as weakness by the hardliners. So it's going to be really hard to de-escalate in that sense, because anyone who steps into the ring to talk to the other side is seen as a traitor.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, about the only way it could happen without dealing with the spoilers, if there was a government, in both Israel and Palestine that did not have those spoilers in them, and that in turn was also willing, not having them in the government is important, because otherwise the government won't be able to make any concessions or peace agreement. So having a government without them, that's the first step. And that's already extremely unlikely given the balance of power in both Israeli and Palestinian politics. Mm-hmm. But if you could somehow do that, if you could somehow get something like the Labor government that governed Israel in the 1990s, even if you could do that, you would then need leadership in that government that was willing to make big, extremely unpopular concessions to the other side in order to reach a middle ground that could actually result in a final agreement. And that's really hard. It takes a very brave politician to try to impose, either a brave or a very arrogant politician to try to impose a policy on his people that is extremely unpopular. And sometimes politicians are willing to do that if it means throwing red meat to their base, right, which are generally a minority. But if it's something that everybody in their society, almost everybody, is not going to like there's no upside. And it's that kind of cost that would have to be incurred by politicians in order to reach a middle ground and get to a final agreement. Keep in mind the Labor government in 1990s Israel negotiated the Oslo Accords. And the prime minister that negotiated them was a guy named Rabin. And people in Israel, specifically the right wing of Israeli politics, were so absolutely ripshit pissed at him for negotiating that agreement that they fucking killed him. He was assassinated by far-right conservatives, by a far-right conservative, who believed that Prime Minister Rabin had betrayed the country. Mm. And there was a lot of people in Israeli politics who actually agreed with that position. So I don't think most politicians want to get shot. So right there, you have a big barrier to overcome in terms of finding leadership that is willing to ignore popular dislike for a given concession or agreement.
I would agree with you that most politicians probably don't want to get shot. I would say I also don't want to get shot unless it's by a camera.
There you go. So I guess that's the short term. Like in the short to medium term, there's virtually no way a two-state solution can be implemented, just given the political realities. Would it be possible long term? Or perhaps to rephrase the question, what would have to happen over the long term to make a two-state solution feasible? And for that, you would need demographic changes. You would need either demographic changes in Israel and Palestine, in which demographics that favor peace overwhelm the demographic groups that oppose peace. That would be needed. Alternatively, you would need some kind of catalyst that changed, that shifted the balance of opinion in Israel and Palestine back towards the moderates and the peaceniks and away from the hawks. And that's very ambiguous, but I have to be ambiguous because I have no idea how the hell that could happen. If it's even possible, that's what would need to happen in order to shift political balance back towards the moderates, to give them enough political capital to get into power and then to negotiate an agreement in good faith. Keep in mind, even after an agreement is negotiated, it has to be sustainable. Because like what you saw with the Oslo Accords, there was a moderate government that wanted peace and negotiated an agreement, and then there was a new conservative government that hated that agreement and then sabotaged it. So it's not enough just to have a government that wants peace to come into power and get an agreement. You have to have commitment from enough of the political spectrum in both parties to ensure that subsequent governments also enforce that agreement. And so that's why it's necessary over the long term for there to be a broad shift in opinion back towards peace. Because otherwise, if the conservative hawkish opinion is still popular, they're just going to inevitably get back into power at some point, and then they're going to scrap the agreement. So that perspective has to become sufficiently unpopular that they can't get back into power in the first place. That's the only way it would work sustainably over the long run. But since I have no idea how the weight of opinion could change, the only other thing I could think of is demographic change. But that's also extremely unlikely because the demographic change right now actually favors the hawks and not the moderates. Right now, the most religious Orthodox Jews in Israel are generally more hawkish in their political outlook. And they're pretty much the future of Israel at this point. Like, just looking at birth rates, they reproduce way faster than sort of the secular part of Israel's population. So over time, they're going to become a larger and larger voting bloc. And if it's not guaranteed, but if, as predicted, they continue to vote in the future as they are now, that's inherently going to translate into greater support for hawkish policies vis-a-vis the Palestine issue. And that in turn will invariably translate into even more intractability vis-a-vis the peace process. Future governments dependent on that voting bloc will be way less likely than even the current government to engage in substantive good faith peace negotiations with the Palestinians. So pretty fucked overall. Not a lot of hope to kind of highlight there. So I can't really offer much encouraging in that regard.
Yeah, tribalism do be pretty fierce. And as we've said, there are thousands of years of reasons why these groups of people might fight each other. So it's not a new conflict in that sense. But the October raid definitely put things in front of people who wouldn't otherwise be browsing the conflict.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, got about 20 minutes, 20 to 30, sorry.
Gotcha. Okay, we had another question. The U.S. seems to have partially walked back its embrace of free trade in response to a growing recognition of its downsides. Are there other aspects of foreign policy which are regressing, quote unquote, similarly, due to new understanding of how the world functions? Well, probably. I would say increasing reluctance by the U.S. government to engage in foreign adventures is definitely one expression in the similar vein, but basically it's part and parcel of a general populist trend in American politics. Populism in the United States has generally been more insular, more skeptical of trade, more skeptical of getting involved in foreign affairs. So insomuch as those factors define populism or are a part of populism, the fact that populism has become ascendant has corresponded with an ascendance of those ideas in policymaking. If that makes any sense. Am I coherent at all here?
I think that makes sense.
Okay. Tripping over my words a little bit. Yeah, so foreign policy is one area, not just in terms of trade, but just in terms of security issues. You can kind of see that in the skepticism about Ukraine, probably especially the backlash to the Iraq War. That I think was a major catalyst, really fueling populist notions about getting the U.S. out of world affairs. But subsequent to the fact, that sentiment has only grown, it seems, even in spite of the fact that the U.S. has become increasingly less active in world affairs than it used to be, which is kind of vexing for me, because I definitely understand why people would want the U.S. to be less involved in foreign affairs, given how shit the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan went. So that makes sense to me. But what doesn't make sense to me is people looking at the United States, is the fact that the United States is less active in world affairs, but people still acting and talking as though it's not less active. Like, people still seem to have these notions that the United States is behind every conflict, is actively trying to undermine governments. But if anything, the criticism from other governments has been that the U.S. is not sufficiently involved. That is the much more common criticism at this point than that the U.S. is being belligerently stupid. So there seems to be some disconnect there between the popular perception of American foreign policy in the United States and the actual foreign policy that we've had over the past 10, 15 years, basically since the Bush administration. I think really the Bush administration just drove people crazy because they were just so arrogant and so reluctant to kind of include the public in their decision making. Like, they really went out of their way just to do what they wanted and then to try to make excuses for it after the fact. And that made people extremely paranoid. Like, I remember it very clearly back in the day. During the early war on terror, just the government was very haughty and had a very arrogant, entitled attitude towards foreign policy. And people were not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, especially as the wars started going badly. And they refused to kind of shift on that. So between the wars being badly managed and the fact that the government just kind of ran the country without regard for the public perception of the conflicts, meant that the public almost permanently turned on them for like a generation, it seems. Just that whole cohort of people alive during that time seem to uniformly now agree that the government can't be trusted on foreign policy, and refuses to give them, not only does it refuse to give the government the benefit of the doubt, but now it implicitly assumes that the government is lying about everything it does around the world, and that critics of the US government, even when they're obviously malicious, might have a point when they criticize the US government. So I do think, perhaps in that sense, there's been an overcorrection. And maybe that's starting to turn around, but honestly, I'm a little skeptical. I don't think a lot of people are really shifting on that too much. We'll see. That is definitely a trend, but that is the same kind of distrust in government that is feeding that turn against international trade, which is what the question was originally about. And so that they are kind of mutually reinforcing forces in that sense that have a common root. But that said, I don't know that I would say this is due to new understandings of how the world functions. This is me being a proofreader. This maybe isn't what you originally intended when you wrote this, but I wouldn't phrase it quite like that. Because I don't think anybody really has, I don't think the broader public has a new understanding of how the world functions. Like, the public was always skeptical of free trade. Like, even when the United States government was saying that it was going to let China into the WTO back in '99, people were pissed, right? There were mass protests in Seattle. And even before that, when the US government was negotiating NAFTA, like, people didn't like that either. The only reason it passed was because the broader public was largely disinterested. A lot of people just didn't really know it was even happening, or when they did hear about it, they didn't really understand the details. But among the people that did know about it, that were vested, that did have vested interests in the outcome, like, most people were pretty well opposed. Especially like blue collar labor in the United States was especially opposed to that. So opposition to free trade, not new. Like, that has deep roots in American politics. And the same can be said for isolationism. Like there's always been isolationist sentiment in US politics. That's never gone away. It's been a persistent presence in politics. So I wouldn't say that people have changed. I would just say that the balance of opinion has shifted towards the anti-trade and isolationist perspective. And again, I would argue that's mostly due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If not also, more in terms of free trade, the fallout from free trade was enormous. Like it had a dramatic effect on the economy. Not entirely negative. I would not paint it as like a disaster, like some people would paint it as. But yeah, there definitely were costs. And the government did a really shit job of trying to address those costs, or even admit that they were real. That was, again, the government from like 2000 to 2010 was just very arrogant. And their whole approach to their whole response to accusations that free trade was incurring big costs in many communities around the United States was that, yeah, there's some problems, but overall it's a net benefit. And in the long run, it won't really matter, so we're just going to ignore this. And as you might guess, people didn't like that. They kind of felt like the government was just throwing them to the wolves, rather. And that it didn't care about the public. So unsurprisingly, that fed a lot of populist sentiment. And again, that shifted the balance of opinion against trade, and then against the wars, and against, foreign intervention generally. So none of that required greater understanding of how the world functions. It just required people to be pissed off at the government and to embrace opposing dissident views that were already pre-existing. Even in the height of the Cold War, when the US government was pretty firmly invested in things like free trade and foreign intervention, there was no shortage of people that were dead set against those things. Labor in the United States was opposed to a lot of free trade and complained bitterly about imports of higher quality foreign goods. When the United States allowed free trade with Japan and West Germany, what happened in the 1960s is that their economies recovered from World War II, and they started exporting a lot of quality stuff to the United States. And by the 1970s, the weight of that import competition had really started to weigh on the manufacturing sector in the United States. And there was a lot of people that complained, like extremely bitterly, that it was unfair, that the US government didn't care about its manufacturing sector, and that it was allowing foreigners to dominate them and destroy American manufacturing. So that sentiment, and obviously there was a lot of anti-trade sentiment in, before World War II, the Hoots-Smalley Act. I'm probably misremembering the name, but yeah, the Hoots-Smalley Act, was an act that raised tariffs across the board in order to restrict import competition in order to favor the manufacturing sector in the United States. And the result was a tit-for-tat retaliation by other developed economies to raise their own tariffs, and that cut off the manufacturing sector in the United States from a major export market. And overall, it was just a net drain for both economies. Yeah, so all of that is pre-existing. So I would not call it a shift in understanding, just a shift in the balance of power between existing factions. I'm kind of belaboring this answer. I hope I'm not boring. It's an interesting topic.
It's fair. It's nice to have an economic break between the war talk. Calms the chat down a little bit.
Yeah, I've noticed that economics seems to have a numbing effect in general. Perhaps not the most exciting topic.
They're like, oh yeah, money does go up and down. That's true. You talk about Israel-Palestine, they're going to bat for one of the sides. I'm going to bat.
Yeah, let me offer some advice to chat. If you really want to get invested in a foreign conflict and raise awareness and just be belligerent about it because you really feel passionate about it, I would not recommend getting into Israel-Palestine because that's a pretty stagnant conflict at this point. It's probably not going to change. It's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. If you really want to get involved in a conflict, get into the Burma Civil War because that's pretty new and it's not clear what the outcome is going to be. It's a very dynamic situation on the ground, and the people fighting in it probably have a lot in common with you. A lot of them are students, people who grew up in a relatively open society, in so much as Burma in the aughts and teens could be considered that. And they're fighting for what they believe is liberal democracy and equality, just human rights, just basic stuff. It's not even like socialism or national liberation or, fighting against, they're not fighting for big ideals. They're fighting just for the basics. Like, let's have a government that doesn't kill us. We would like that.
That's something I can support.
Yeah, I feel like the rebels in Burma are pretty sympathetic overall. And they do need help. It's not particularly well funded, and it's not a conflict that people pay attention to. Mm-hmm. So if you really want to get invested in a conflict and just raise hell about it, try that one. That one could really use new blood. That could use new followers online. Israel-Palestine has plenty already. It doesn't need more. Mm-hmm. So maybe divide your attention a little bit and give some love to Burma.
I remember when we first went over that one, that had a pretty violent start to it.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty much faded out of the news from what I can tell, at least in terms of what makes headlines lately.
Yeah, there was a big offensive there recently. Had you heard of that at all?
No.
Yeah, so, the Civil War has a lot of different factions. Obviously, the military government is one. The liberal reformist faction, comprised largely of students and other protesters who had tried to challenge the government after the initial coup a couple of years ago, they comprise their own faction. And they're largely technically, organizationally, they follow a government in exile that was set up of some of the civilian officials in the previous government that had been overthrown. I think they're called the PUG. I don't quite remember exactly. But that's one fact. So those are two factions, the military government and then the government in exile. But then there's also a whole bunch of ethnic militias in the northeast of the country that have been fighting against the government for like 70 years, basically like right after independence was declared from the British. A lot of ethnic groups that didn't want to be a part of a united Burma rose up against the government and started fighting for independence. And the fighting in northeastern Burma has continued in on again, off again, ever since. Like it's one of the longest running conflicts on the planet at this point. But over the course of the past 10 years, that conflict had been tampered down significantly. The military government had made deals with various ethnic militias, not peace agreements per se, but basically ceasefires and various agreements that allowed some degree of economic activity that both could benefit from. So the ethnic militias were still in control of their various territories when the coup happened and when the current conflict started. And it was not inevitable that the ethnic militias would side with the rebels fighting against the military government. Again, they already had their own agreements with the military government. But a lot of the rebels, a lot of the dissidents that wanted to overthrow the military government came to the ethnic militias for training and assistance. And so the result is that ties between the rebels and the ethnic militias increased over time. And recently what happened is that the ethnic militias basically came out very explicitly for the rebels and against the government. Three of the major ones banded together in an alliance and launched an offensive that has effectively ejected the national army from the entire northeastern region of the country. Its presence had already been kind of light, but they were able to still at least control the border as well as important towns in the interior of the northeastern region. But now, the ethnic militias have seized all of the border region with China, as well as the major towns and cities. And last I checked, they had managed to destroy and overrun something like over 100 military outposts and bases in the region. So it's not going to be a decisive blow per se, because again, this was not a region the government really controlled much of in the first place, but it is a major blow for the government in so much as they had been deriving revenue from controlling the border as well as other territories in the region. So all of that is going to be gone now, and the rebels now are pretty obviously and openly in alliance with the ethnic militias. So a positive development, but not a groundbreaking one. as far as the trajectory of the Civil War.
Pull up the map again. Burma, also known as Myanmar, which is the current name?
So officially, legally, it's Myanmar. But before the 1980s, it was called Burma, and the only reason the name was changed was because the military government changed it. They themselves took the initiative and changed it in order to try to bolster the legitimacy of their government. Because Myanmar is like a historical term for the territory in question. And Burma is more of like a foreign colonial type term that was applied.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
But, dissidents in Burma argue that they argue that the military government had no right to change the name of the country because it wasn't legitimate. And so they make a point of using the old name in order to show their resistance to the military government. So to a degree, whether you use the term Myanmar or Burma is a political statement about whether you support the government or dissidents.
So,
and in general,
the rebels are the ones fighting for rights and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And those are the ones who are trying to call it Burma?
Yeah.
Okay. Just trying to keep that straight. So Myanmar is the name that the military government has called it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. It's a pretty big country in terms of land area.
Pretty decent sized, but not much of it is really arable. A lot of it is rugged mountains and hills and whatnot. Pretty much just the middle section of the country, like the middle third roughly, is where almost all of the flat arable land is.
Yeah, I can see the concentrations of roads and stuff is a good way to see population density, and there is that center pocket, but then all around the outside of it, there's just like one road that goes through a huge empty mass. But then they have this long stretch of coastline next to Thailand.
Oh yeah, that little stretch there.
Yeah, it doesn't really look like there are that many cities along it.
Yeah, easily the vast majority of the population, that is to say, the weight of population density in the country is heavily centered in the middle. And that's also where the government's base of support is. That's where their presence and control is the strongest. Generally, the further away from that you go, the less control they exert. Which is not to say that people in the center of the country uniformly support the government. It's just that because that's the economic center, that's where most of the military forces are. And so that's where they're able to maintain control the best. The edges of the country in the northeast, and the northwest, and the southwest, that's where they're weaker. And that's where the rebels have made the most gains over the course of the conflict. The rebels have been contesting some control in the middle of the country, but largely that's things like hit-and-run attacks and assassinations, rather than launching open operations to contest actual government control.
Right, so this would be asymmetric conflict where the military has like all the big stuff and they're just people that are trying to resist it, but they don't have their own like full military.
Exactly.
There's a terrain map here too. Chat's showing me the different terrains.
Yeah, you can kind of see the mountains and the rugged terrain better there.
Yeah. Looks like Laos also has a lot of that same terrain.
Oh, yeah. And most of the flat territory is in the west of Laos along the Mekong River. The Mekong River actually comprises Laos's western border. So most of the population lives close to the river, unsurprisingly. Yeah, Laos used to be a part of Thailand originally, but during the period of European colonial expansion in the late 1800s, the French were able to acquire it, quote unquote. And it's been independent of Thailand ever since.
Interesting that Thailand, I think, was one of those countries that was never fully under colonial control.
Yeah, they were never colonized. Lots of Western influence, And they were never entirely in control of their own fate. To a degree, they were able to avoid being colonized because they became a buffer state between the French and British empires. You can see Burma there to the west of Thailand. That was a British territory.
Mm-hmm.
And then Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all comprised French Indochina, a part of the French Empire. And both the French and British governments recognized that there could be a competition over Thailand, but that it would be better to avoid potential escalation. It would be better to avoid fighting over it, to avoid potential escalation into a general conflict. And so both agreed to kind of make Thailand the natural buffer state between their empires. Mm. And as a result, Thailand was able to largely avoid being preyed upon. They did lose some territories to the British and French, but they were able to maintain their independence. It's a very interesting, cool country.
A good friend of mine is Thai. He's gone back a few times to visit, but it's always fun whenever you go to a restaurant with a particular country's cuisine and you have someone who speaks the language. There are hidden menu items that you didn't know about, and you can usually get a better price too. So it's always great whenever they sit us down, they give us the menus. He says something in Thai to them, and they go bring out a different menu, and it's like half the price or 2/3 price of normal, and they've got more, I guess, authentic stuff that Americans probably wouldn't want to order, but for Thai locals is like the traditional stuff.
Yeah. Thai food is awesome. Strong recommend.
Yeah. Great flavors. That's one of the things that a lot of these warmer countries are known for, is the spices that they put in the food. I've seen lots of different articles arguing why spicy food is a staple for them. Some of them, it's like the food keeps better when it's spicy, or if you sweat while you eat, that helps you regulate your own temperature. But at the end of the day, it's really tasty and flavorful. So I think that's one of the most important parts. And lots of different chilies and peppers will grow in those warmer climates too.
Oh yeah, lots of variety, lots of cultural influence from surrounding countries. Chinese, American influences, etc. All of that combined rather to make what is today modern Thai cuisine. Mm-hmm. And it kind of shows. It definitely has its distinctions, but you can see all the different influences that came into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was
Love
another.
Pad Thai. Huh?
Pad Thai is very good. Another question for Agent Smith. Do you think the Jones Act is still necessary today? Is the added shipbuilding capacity so essential to national security that it's worth the added transportation costs?
The Cato Institute is in chat. The Cato Institute complains about the Jones Act constantly. It's like one of their bugbears. It's got to be a donor. There's got to be some set of donors out there that are paying them to do it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also just a libertarian thing. They don't like government regulation, and the Jones Act is like one of the oldest forms of, one of the oldest focuses of people who oppose government regulation has been the Jones Act.
For the uninitiated, what is the Jones Act?
Oh, the Jones Act restricts cargo ships. Well, restricts interport trade between ports in the United States to American-made cargo ships. Or is it American-made or is it American-owned? I want to say American-made, but maybe it's American-owned. Regardless, it severely limits the accessibility of American ports to foreign ships. Not regard to international trade. Like if you're moving goods from the United States to a foreign country, the Jones Act does not apply. Mm-hmm. So any ships can come, from abroad and do that. But what if you want to move goods? What if you want to move goods from, say, New Orleans to the port of New York City? Mm-hmm. The Jones Act would apply there. And in that case, you would have to get an American merchant firm to do that. And it has to be an American ship that you move the goods on. And, not a lot of cargo ships these days are made in America. So the American merchant marine is way, way smaller than it used to be. And the result is that the cost of moving goods between ports in the United States is much higher than it would be otherwise. Mm-hmm. So if you got rid of the Jones Act, you could actually see a major renaissance in interport trade between American ports. Because right now the cost is just so prohibitive that it's actually just easier to import stuff from abroad than to import stuff from another port in the United States.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, like that's one of the reasons why a lot of different regions in the United States will actually import oil from places like West Africa or the Middle East rather than just having it brought by oil tanker from Texas, right?
Huh.
You could load up an oil tanker at Houston with Texan crude oil, and then you could ship it to New York or San Francisco or something. But that's actually so cost prohibitive, it's cheaper just to buy it from abroad.
Wow. Actually, that makes it seem like it would also be an environmentalist's issue to try to get the Jones Act to go away, because you're basically making it cheaper for ships to travel way, 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 way further to give you the same good that you could get from nearby, but the fees are so high that that's cheaper for you from a financial standpoint. But from a practical logistical standpoint, like getting a boat from West Africa to the US as opposed to Texas is like way more distance.
Yeah, but that's just how great the disparity in cost is.
Wow. Wait, what's the plus side of the Jones Act?
The Cato Institute's influence grows wide.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of joining whatever this is.
It's a libertarian think tank. It's one of the older ones. Mm-hmm. Probably one of the better ones. They do decent analysis. They just kind of harp a lot on very specific things too much. So the reason the Jones Act was originally implemented was to try to preserve the merchant marine in the United States. Over the course of World War I and World War II, cargo ships were very important to the war effort. Obviously, we needed to keep supplies moving to allies across the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And we also needed those ships to move troops, abroad. Mm-hmm. So in the event of a conflict, it's very useful to have a ready, large supply of cargo ships that the government can appropriate for its own purposes, for the war effort. But the trouble that occurred actually even after World War I, but especially after World War II, is that more and more cargo ships being used in American trade were being made abroad and not in the United States. And in fact, were not even owned by American companies. Basically more and more international trade was being conducted not by American shipping companies, but by Japanese shipping companies or Hong Kong shipping companies, or some of them were just, sort of international companies that had like vague national associations. So what a lot of people would do is they would set up like shell companies, and then they would flag their ships using countries that had very cheap registration. So, if you're going to if you want to engage in international trade with a ship, you have to register it. And in places like the United States and Europe, the fees that you have to pay to do that are relatively high. So to save money, what a lot of companies started doing is they would go to countries that went out of their way to pass laws that made registration of ships there very, very cheap so that they could grab a whole bunch of that revenue. And generally, these were poorer countries that didn't have a lot of other options. So Greece is one example. I think there's a couple others too. It suddenly slips my mind. Greece is like one of the main ones. Greece is known for this. So a lot of ships, Panama, actually, that's what it was. Panama and Greece are some of the leaders in this regard. So there are virtually no cargo ships that are actually made in Greece or Panama. But a disproportionately huge share of global shipping is flagged with those countries. That is to say, is registered under those countries' governments and is technically Panamanian or Greek, legally speaking. And that just basically just came down to the fees and whatnot. So between companies moving abroad to take advantage of cheaper fees and foreign producers of ships taking more and more market share from American ship producers, the size of the American merchant marine shrank considerably, to the point where it was already considered a national security threat, even in the 1930s. So the Jones Act was passed, before that, in order to try to ensure that there was at least some market where the American merchant marine would have a guaranteed income and could therefore support itself and continue to exist. Mm-hmm. And that's what the Jones Act therefore does. It basically grants not a monopoly per se, because there's multiple actors, but it protects the market for interport American trade and reserves it explicitly for the American merchant marine.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the purpose.
Job security for the merchant marine.
Effectively, yeah, but also national security considerations. If there were a war, you want to have ships. Well, the government wants to have ships that it could nationalize effectively and use for the war effort.
Gotcha.
Because you could argue, and this is the argument the military actually makes, if you get rid of the Jones Act, the American merchant marine will not be able to stay competitive and it will go out of business. And then there will be effectively no American cargo ships. And they argue that that is not an acceptable outcome. Now, hypothetically, the counter argument is that, if that's true, then the government itself should just have its own cargo ships. But they don't want to do that, not least because of lobbying by the merchant marine companies themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it's been. The military has gotten the better of the argument. The national security argument almost always wins. And so the result is that the Jones Act has stayed on the books. But the Cato Institute and libertarians in particular have argued for decades now that it's a dumb law and that there are better ways to serve national security, better ways to deal with the national security considerations of removing the Jones Act. I would point out, too, that one of the negative consequences of the Jones Act, Cato should be paying me for this. One of the negative consequences of the Jones Act, besides the fact that interport trade is just prohibitively expensive and that it distorts trade between American regions, is that island territories of the United States in particular are harmed by this. So if you live on an island, you import most of the stuff you're going to consume, right? So you're very dependent, you're very sensitive to the cost of importing goods by ship. So, for example, think of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands. These are all island territories, right? Also Alaska, not an island, but separated, sufficiently separated from the United States that it actually imports a lot of stuff by ship, rather than by road, by truck or whatnot. So, all of these places are very sensitive to the price of shipping. And the Jones Act, because it is, the Jones Act applies to them, right? Those are all American territories. So the only ships that can service those ports, that can service those island territories, are American ships. But because the Jones Act protects them from international competition, the fees are much higher than they would be otherwise. And in turn, the cost of living and the cost of importing goods to these island territories is higher than it would be otherwise, with corresponding negative impact on the quality of life and the purchasing power of incomes on the islands.
Interesting.
Yeah, so people in Puerto Rico in particular have complained a lot about the Jones Act. Now, there's a fun addendum here. I actually was talking to Jill on Facebook. You remember her, I'm sure. And I was talking to her years ago about the Jones Act, and I actually was sufficiently interested to go and do some research on it. And I actually found a paper talking about it. And what they found, like just looking at the empirical data, is that the Jones Act did not seem to actually substantively increase costs for shipping costs in places like Puerto Rico in the United States. What they found instead is that results were ambiguous. Certainly the Jones Act cannot be argued to have anything other than a detrimental effect on the cost of shipping to Puerto Rico. But it's not really clear if the costs is significantly higher. I mean, the costs are not significantly higher than they are for other parts of the United States. And it's not clear if the reason they're higher is just due to the Jones Act. It could just be that shipping costs to islands is inherently higher. So there's more to the story than just the Jones Act making it more expensive to import stuff to islands. There are other factors that are pushing those costs higher. And it may not then be the case that rescinding the Jones Act would necessarily have a big positive impact on the cost of shipping to places like Puerto Rico. It would certainly have an impact, though, on things like oil imports and trade between ports on the continental United States. That would definitely have an impact, but it's not clear how much of an impact it would have on other territories beyond the continental United States, like Puerto Rico and Guam. So the empirical evidence is a little more mixed on that count specifically.
Interesting.
Did that answer the original question? I don't remember exactly what he was getting at.
I don't know. What do you think?
What was the wording? Something Jones Act, and then I went off talking about the critique.
Is it
of it.
still necessary today? Is
Oh,
the
is it
added
still
shipbuilding
necessary?
capacity so essential to national security that it's worth the added transportation costs?
Gotcha. I mean, the answer really depends on how important you think. Well, for one, it depends on how important you think it is for the United States military to have those cargo ships and the merchant marine available for an emergency. And then it also depends on the degree to which you think the government could provide an alternative in lieu of a protected class of merchant marine companies that have privileged access to the American market. Again, it could be that the U.S. government itself, or maybe even the U.S. military, could just build its own cargo ships and then have them sort of maybe mothballed or have them specially purposed for some kind of charity or humanitarian purpose, and then could just pay for them that way, or maybe even just have the government cover all of the costs. I mean, the military itself is a contingency that the government pays for in case of emergency. So it's not as though the idea of having a large standing force that doesn't necessarily do stuff most of the time is not worth the cost. So you could consider maintaining a state-owned and run merchant marine in a similar vein. It would be costly, sure, but you get something out of it. You get that reserve of cargo ships available should you need it. But of course, the idea of the government running a merchant marine or owning lots of cargo ships and having them compete, with private sector entities, or even if they don't compete with private, just the fact that the government would be owning cargo ships at all for an unclear purpose and maybe not even using them most of the time, that itself would be controversial given that antipathy in American politics to large government action and intervention in the market. So the answer is it depends. It's subjective. Certainly the military and national security hawks have come down very much on the side of the Jones Act. I think there's a good argument to be made that you could get rid of it and not have significant downsides for the national security side, but you would have to do things that would be very unpopular in the current milieu of American politics. And in that sense, the alternatives to the Jones Act are not really politically viable. And so in that sense, the equilibrium probably is maintenance of the Jones Act. Maybe if the Cato Institute can convince enough people that the cost is not worth it, maybe then the alternatives may seriously be considered. But until such time, we're probably stuck with it.
The Jones Act. Just in case a battle is in your area, we want to make sure the merchant marines are ready to go. Yeah, the only political bills or items that I've been motivated enough about to talk to other people about and hand out papers were Citizens United and Glass-Steagall, and that was part of the Occupy protest that was rolling through Dallas.
I remember you guys going to those.
Yeah. Interesting times. I have to check to see if I still have some of the pictures, because I brought a camera and I took a bunch of pictures of people. It would probably be funny to look at nowadays.
Yeah, I remember I went with you guys one time down to the camp they'd set up in front of City Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was it's a very interesting experience. I don't get out a lot in general, so just being outside was kind of unusual for me. But it was especially cool just to kind of witness that historical event. Even if it didn't end up having a big impact on politics, it was certainly a major event at the time.
Yeah, for sure. It was an eye-opener for me as well, because I hadn't been to a protest before then, so I wasn't quite sure how the just interactions between people would go overall. And it was a lot more disjointed and fragmented than I expected it to be. I thought it would be more so that everyone kind of knew why they were there and they were all arguing for the same thing. But there's almost like a protester type of person who that's their hobby to go to these. And whether it's about one issue or another doesn't really matter. They just like being in that environment. And that's valid. It was just kind of surprising to me that it wasn't as unified as I thought it was going to be in purpose, whenever there was kind of at least a stated purpose in the news as to why people were wanting to be active about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't mean to kind of extend the runtime here. I know we were about like 20 minutes out. I'm sure we're well
good.
over that.
I'm stuck in a game with the Protoss who's playing very weird, so you're fine.
Is that right?
Yes.
Gotcha. Well, my apologies. I didn't. Hopefully, you can find your way out soon.
You're totally good. Thanks for keeping me company when I'm trapped in here with this gamer.
Well, I think we got all of the questions. Oh, I think there was one. Go ahead.
We have 300 people, so I don't know if the flags would be interesting.
Well, the flags are always interesting.
Oh.
Always game for flags. Let me see. I think there was one weird story, though, that happened recently. I don't think I wrote it down, though. Okay, I'd have to dig for it. Let's see. Flag. Oh, yeah, I got a pretty decent number today. Belarus. I'm always surprised to see Belarus on here.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be a native, too, because I don't think there's a lot of expats in Belarus.
I guess you could be motivated to VPN as Belarus, but I don't know why.
Yeah, I remember some people joking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, 2 from Taiwan. Yeah, I remember you had one guy, when I asked him where he was from, and he said he was from the Kaohsiung, the southern city, basically the second city of Taiwan, second largest city. Yeah, I don't know if he's the same guy. Let's see, Chile. Puerto Rico. I didn't know Puerto Rico had its own flag on here. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, though. Well, they picked a good day to listen. Mm-hmm. We did talk about Puerto Rico a little bit. Croatia. That's a fun one. Yeah, Croatia doesn't get much attention. It's very rarely in the news. Are you familiar with Croatia at all?
Not too well. Is it in the Balkans?
Oh, yeah. Thoroughly. It is thoroughly in the Balkans.
It is very in the Balkans.
Yeah. They were one of the major combatants in the Yugoslav wars back in the 90s.
Ah.
And it doesn't get much more Balkans than the Yugoslav wars. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Croatia was definitely a part thereof. Well, you're familiar with Serbia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Croatia, maybe they won't like hearing this, but Croatia is very, very similar culturally and linguistically to Serbians. Even linguistic differences are pretty minor. Like, I think the official language of Yugoslavia was Serbo-Croat, and basically the languages are so mutually intelligible that they're effectively the same language, Croatian and Serbian. And after the Civil War started, a lot of ultra-nationalists in both Serbia and Croatia actually went out of their way to try to create and find old words that had fallen out of usage in the language in order to get them back into usage so that the language would be less similar, so that they could argue that they were actually distinct languages. Yeah, other than that, the major difference is religion. So the Serbs obviously are Orthodox Christian, but the Croatians are Catholic.
I did not know that.
Yeah, that was one of the dividing lines in the Civil War. It wasn't just ethno-nationalist identities, although that was definitely the main thing, but it was also sometimes framed as Orthodox versus Catholics. Mm-hmm. there was also a lot of historical grievances. So, some of them painted as Nazis. Specifically, the Serbs painted the Croatians as Nazis because there was a number of Croatian collaborators / nationalists. The Nazis carved Croatia out of Yugoslavia during World War II and made it independent. And then there was a fascist Croatian party called the Ustashi, if I remember correctly, that allied with the Nazis and helped them try to occupy the rest of what had been Yugoslavia. And so some Serbian nationalists are still butthurt about that.
Makes sense.
Yeah. There was a lot of different framings for the war. I won't get into all of them. But yeah, Croatians are a very interesting people that sometimes get overlooked. Serbia is much more well known, but that's largely because they just got blamed for the Yugoslav wars. They don't entirely deserve that blame, but I think even they would admit at least one of the few upsides of being blamed for the Yugoslav wars is that everybody knows about Serbia now. You can't say that they haven't gained some notoriety. So Croatia, in contrast, has not gotten nearly as well known, despite being the other major combatant in the Yugoslav wars. And so their identity has kind of suffered as a result. Their brand, if you will, has suffered as a result.
Yeah, brands can be deceptive, though, as we learned from Mr. Ben Salman or whatever, about how there's so much news that goes through the pipeline. If you can manage your brand well enough, you can make it good, even if your backstory isn't the best.
Yeah, very true.
Or you can get a bad rap because other people do a good job of branding you as a villain, which is an often used tactic. Villainize those enemies. Well, chat was relatively more chill today. Good job, chat. More chill than last week. I was peeking at this and that, but didn't really get into as many fights. So let's give a round of applause for chat not shitting the bed, even though we talked about Israel-Palestine. Well done.
Well done.
And with a pretty high viewership, too. So hats off to all of you. And after the segment, Agent Smith does look through the chat on Twitch in the VOD and then also in the YouTube comments. So if you have any feedback for us, or if we got anything wrong, or there's a region that we're ignorant about and you want to share, we want to learn too. So this isn't us telling y'all how it is. We're just trying to figure things out too. So if you have any information to share, feel free to do so. In the Who Is It command, you can find his Twitter. So if you want to send him a message or link him something or email him, you may do so. But thank you, as always, for coming on and refreshing my week and giving me a sense of what's going on in the world. I appreciate that very much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me on. It's always a privilege.
I
did meet your challenge from last week.
You did? Did you do the push-ups as well?
I did, which was very uncomfortable because that's probably the first time in 2 years that I've done any.
Yeah! Hell yeah.
I imagine my form was not up to snuff.
That's okay, because you're issued the same challenge this week. We'll see if you can do a repeat.
Oh, I can. I don't know if my shoulders will much appreciate it, but I imagine I can.
Well, don't hurt yourself, but I encourage you to try.
That's the plan.
Well, thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions. Thank you, chat, for weighing in on the discussion. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.